The Danger of Lying in Bed by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more, LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothman. The Danger of Lying in Bed by Mark Twain. The man in the ticket office said, "Have an accident insurance ticket also?" "No," I said, after studying the matter over a little. "No, I believe not. I'm going to be traveling by rail all day today. However, tomorrow I don't travel. Give me one for tomorrow." The man looked puzzled. He said, "But it is for accident insurance, and if you're going to travel by rail—" "If I'm going to travel by rail, I shan't need it. Lying at home in bed is the thing I'm afraid of." I had been looking into this matter. Last year I traveled 20,000 miles, almost entirely by rail. The year before I traveled over 25,000 miles, half by sea, half by rail. And the year before that I traveled in the neighborhood of 10,000 miles, exclusively by rail. I suppose if I put in all the little odd journeys here and there, I may say I have traveled 60,000 miles during the 3 years I have mentioned, and never had an accident. For a good while I said to myself every morning, "Now I have escaped thus far, and so the chances are just that much increased that I shall catch it this time. I will be shrewd and buy an accident ticket." And to a dead moral certainty I drew a blank and went to bed that night without a joint started or a bone splintered. I got tired of the sort of daily bother and fell to buying accident tickets that were good for a month. I said to myself, "A man can't buy 30 blanks in one bundle." But I was mistaken. There was never a prize in the lot. I could read of railway accidents every day. The newspaper atmosphere was foggy with them. But somehow they never came my way. I found that I had spent a good deal of money in the accident business and had nothing to show for it. My suspicions were aroused, and I began to hunt around for somebody who had won in this lottery. I found plenty of people who had invested, but not an individual that had ever had an accident or made a cent. I stopped buying accident tickets and went to ciphering. The result was astonishing. The peril lay not in traveling, but in staying at home. I hunted up statistics and was amazed to find that after all the glaring newspaper headlines concerning railroad disasters, less than 300 people had really lost their lives by those disasters in the preceding 12 months. The Erie Road was set down as the most murderous in the list. It had killed 46, or 26. I do not exactly remember which, but I know the number was double that of any other road. But the fact straightway suggested itself that the Erie was an immensely long road, and did more business than any other line in the country. So the double number of killed ceased to be a matter for surprise. By further figuring, it appeared that between New York and Rochester, the Erie ran 8 passenger trains each way each day, 16 altogether, and carried an average of 6,000 persons. That is about 1 million in 6 months, the population of New York City. Well, the Erie kills from 13 to 23 people of its million in 6 months, and in the same time 13,000 of New York's million die in their beds. My flesh crept. My hair stood on end. "This is appalling," I said. "The danger isn't in traveling by rail, but in trusting to those deadly beds. I will never sleep in a bed again." I had figured on considerably less than 1/2 the length of the Erie Road. It was plain that the entire road must transport at least 11 or 12,000 people per day. There are many short roads running out of Boston that do fully half as much, a great many such roads. There are many roads scattered around the Union that do prodigious passenger business. Therefore, it is fair to presume that an average of 2,500 passengers a day for each road in the country would be almost correct. There are 846 rail lines in our country, and 846 times 2,500 are 2,115,000. So the railways of America move more than 2 millions of people each day, 650 millions of people a year, without counting the Sundays. They do that too, there is no question about it, though where they get the raw materials is clear beyond the jurisdiction of my arithmetic, for I have hunted the census through and through, and I find that there is not that many people in the United States, by a matter of 610 millions at the very least. They must use some of the same people over again. Likely. San Francisco is 1/8 as populous as New York. There are 60 deaths a week in the former, and 500 a week in the latter, if they have luck. That is 3,120 deaths a year in San Francisco, and 8 times as many in New York, say about 25,000 or 26,000. The health of the two places is the same, so we will let it stand as a fair presumption that this will hold good all over the country, and that consequently 25,000 out of every million of people we have must die each year. That amounts to 1/14 of our total population. 1 million of us, then, die annually. Out of this million, 10 or 12,000 are stabbed, shot, drowned, hanged, poisoned, or meet a similar violent death in some other popular way, such as perishing by kerosene lamp or hoop-skirt conflagrations, getting buried in coal mines, falling off housetops, breaking through church or lecture room floors, taking patent medicines, or committing suicide in other forms. The Erie Railroad kills 23 to 46, and the other 845 railroads kill an average of 1/3 of a man each, and the rest of that million, amounting in an aggregate to that appalling figure of 987,631 corpses, die naturally in their beds. You will excuse me from taking any more chances on those beds. The railroads are good enough for me. And my advice to all people is, don't stay at home any more than you can help, but when you have got to stay at home a while, buy a package of those insurance tickets and sit up nights. You cannot be too cautious. One can see now why I answered that ticket agent in the manner recorded at the top of this sketch. The moral of this composition is that thoughtless people grumble more than is fair about railroad management in the United States. When we consider that every day and night of the year full 14,000 railway trains of various kinds, freighted with life and armed with death, go thundering over the land, the marvel is not that they kill 300 human beings in a 12-month, but that they do not kill 300 times 300. The end of The Danger of Lying in Bed by Mark Twain.
Part 1 of Europe in the Middle of the 17th Century by Martin Philipson, from The History of All Nations, from Earliest Times, Volume 13, The Age of Louis XIV, translated under the supervision of John Henry Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr Natter. To its great loss, Germany had for 30 years been the centre of the political and military activity of Europe. Seldom has a people been stricken with such a calamity as were the Germans through the ruinous war for religion. That the country not only survived, but gradually elevated itself from its wretched state, is a proof of its indestructible vitality and essential soundness. The numerical strength of the armies was not such as utterly to ruin, even by their long continued presence, a country so rich as the Germany of the beginning of the 17th century. The actual armies did not average in number more than 30,000 to 40,000 men, but camp followers hung about the combatants, and they too had to be fed. At the end of the war the united Imperial Bavarian army comprised 40,000 soldiers who drew rations, and 140,000 camp followers who got nothing. All these had to live at the cost of the peaceful, industrious population. As the pay was much higher then than it is now in the German armies, it was invariably in arrears, and the soldiers had to resort to plundering to maintain themselves. When they had once entered on the path of violence, there was no means of checking them in their wild career. In their depredations they halted at nothing. Rank, sex, place, were not sacred to them. Violence was done to churches, altars, and even to graves. Robbery, burning, torture, and murder were perpetrated from sheer delight therein on friend and foe alike. From all over Germany, from Pomerania to Swabia, from East Friesland to Austria, arose, with terrible uniformity, the same wail of despair. Imperialists, Leaguists, Swedes, Hessians, Bavarians alike, fell upon the peaceful homesteads, took all that was of worth to them, destroyed and devastated the rest, wantonly slaughtered the cattle, wasted the fields and orchards, tortured the inhabitants to extort from them a disclosure of their hidden valuables, outraged women, and dragged the most beautiful away with them and sold them like cattle. On their departure they not seldom set fire to the villages and towns. Even the forests were burned down and the fish ponds drained, out of mere wantonness. When a place defended itself, all the inhabitants were ruthlessly murdered except the few rich, from whom they sought to secure ransoms by the most fiendish tortures of all kinds. It was a favourite amusement of these monsters to impale helpless infants, dash them against walls, or roast them in stoves. In short, the soldiers' motto was "Whoever owns anything is our foe." Nor were the leaders more forbearing than their men. Count Königsmarck, once a poor German page, carried off enough to Sweden to leave his family a yearly income of 130,000 thalers. [Footnote: The thaler was a silver coin having an intrinsic value of 72 cents, but it must be remembered that the purchasing power of money was 3 times as great at the period of the 30 Years' War as at present.] To these devastations by the soldiery and the heavy taxes imposed for the maintenance of the troops, there were added the exorbitant war contributions levied by the generals from hostile towns and districts. In one small section of Hanover, Tilly, within 3 years, exacted 2,000,000 thalers. In one single year the little town of Goslar had to contribute 544,000 thalers. Brandenburg was laid under contribution by Wallenstein and Montecuccoli to the amount of 20,000,000 thalers, and so on through a long list. The distress was universal. Business and exchange of every kind were further harmed by the debasement of the coinage, which was practised by all the German princes, especially in the years 1621 to 1623, Brunswick having set the example. In place of standard metal the coins were composed of copper or simply of sheet iron lightly silvered over. No one would accept them at their normal value, and the uncertainty and confusion became so great that dealers and innkeepers took down their signs. So-called money was in abundance, but no one could get anything like its face value for it. A good thaler sold for 8, 15, and at last 20 thalers of the debased coinage. A bushel of corn brought 40 thalers of such money, a pitcher of wine 130. At last the taxes were paid in the debased money, and the gain slipped through the fingers of the princes. Then they remedied matters by calling in the new coinage at its real worth, and issuing coins of full value. But they had defrauded their poor subjects to the extent of the difference in value between the debased and the genuine money, and had done irretrievable injury to business. All industries were at standstill, even the busy hands of the husbandman was addressed. Whole villages died out, multitudes concealed themselves in forests, caves, and ravines. Hunger gnawed the vitals of the people, who in their anguish ate human flesh, and even broke into graves, ascended the gallows and robbed the wheel, to prey on the corpses there. Men fought over horseflesh, and slew one another. More terrible still, men slaughtered human beings, especially defenceless children, that they might devour them. These horrors are not fables, but facts reported by eye witnesses hundreds of times. In consequence of famine and unwholesome food, typhus fever and other contagious diseases broke out, and carried off what the sword had spared. During the siege of Augsburg by the Imperialists in 1634, 60,000 citizens and country people who had taken refuge within the walls died. In Munich alone, then a town of only moderate size, 15,000 people perished within a year. The fever penetrated the remotest districts and most secluded mountain valleys. On all roads were to be seen pest chapels, erected to deliver the land from the terrible scourge. It was at this time that the natives of Ober Ammergau in Upper Bavaria, with the same object, instituted the Passion Play. No wonder that the result was an enormous decrease in the population in all parts of Germany, the effects of which continue to this day. It has been estimated that the population of the Empire in 1648 was only a third of what it was in 1618. In Brandenburg, by 1630, many cities were so nearly desolate that half of the houses were uninhabited, and the severest devastations were yet to come. Berlin, which suffered comparatively little from the war, numbered at its close not more than 300 burghers. In Saxony the wolves multiplied to such an extent that they entered the villages and even the smaller towns in bands. In Dresden the entire suburbs were torn down or burned. The city itself contained only the 15th part of its former population. In Thuringia whole districts lay in ashes. The younger men had been drafted off to the war, in which most of them had perished, while the older people had either fled or succumbed to pestilence and the hardships of war. In the county of Henneberg, for example, the population had sunk from 61,000 to 16,000, and even at the present day many towns have not recovered the population which they had in 1618. In Nassau the villages dwindled away to a few houses, and were often entirely deserted. In Wiesbaden the market place and many streets were overgrown with thorns and brush, so that hares and partridges bred among them. Other streets had disappeared entirely, and become merged in the forest. In Franconia the depopulation was so great that every man was allowed to take 2 wives, and no man under 60 could enter a monastery. In Württemberg 312 clergymen died in 1 year, and at Christmas 1635 over 100 churches were without priests. Many other cases could be cited to illustrate the universal desolation at the end of 30 Years' War. A contemporaneous work, Extidium Germaniae, depicts the condition of the country as follows: "One may travel 40 miles without seeing man or beast, except that in a village here and there you find an old man and a child, or 2 old women. In all the villages the houses are filled with the stench of carcasses, men, wife, children, servants, horses, swine, cows, and oxen lying intermingled, slain by pest and hunger, and gnawed at by wolves, dogs, and carrion crows, because there is no one left to bury them." How had the German cities, formerly the main seats of German culture, degenerated? Though since the time of the Reformation they had lost much of their earlier political importance through the continually increasing power of the territorial princes, they had remained comfortable and industrious, and at the beginning of the war were the seats of a pleasant social life. Their edifices rose stately and strong within their tower-crowned walls. Their streets were well paved, and their water supply and drainage carefully provided for. They were still, in 1618, the guardians of German civilization. But the cities were both morally and materially injured by the debasement of the coinage, even at the beginning of the war. Then the armies began to roll past them, putting a stop to business and industry. Next these demanded admission within the walls, and quarters, maintenance, and contributions, the soldiers perpetrating all possible excesses. Finally came the storming and capture of numerous cities, which all but annihilated them for a time. Pestilence and hunger did their fatal work. Nor did the free imperial cities fare better than the provincial towns. The Hanseatic League also came to an end, King Christian IV annulling its last privileges in Denmark and Norway. In 1628 it held its last Diet, only to announce the breaking up of the ancient union with the humiliating declaration that "the northern kings are the rulers appointed by God over the seas washing the German coast." Three cities, Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck, which still continued the name of the Hansa, maintained a carrying trade on a small scale, but even of this the lion's share fell to the foreigners, the traffic being chiefly carried on in English and Dutch ships. Instead of exporting wares, the ships left the harbours of Germany in ballast, and each year 50 or 60 millions of thalers went in this way over the sea, never to be seen again. Individual princes, after the restoration of peace, sought to better the economical condition of their lands, but they did this in accordance with the false views of the mercantile system then prevailing, that is, with one-sided patronage and artificial promotion of the weaker industries to the prejudice of that great branch which was then by far the most natural and the most profitable for Germany, namely agriculture. The national welfare was checked by unwise restrictions on intercourse and traffic in the interior. Navigation on the rivers was burdened by endless tolls, and was thus rendered impossible for remote distances. Every one of the innumerable little German principalities was hemmed in by almost prohibitive import and export duties. These exactions and impediments to interstate commerce worked all the more harmfully because the Empire, split up into so many petty principalities, could not, as against the foreigner, carry out a united commercial policy, nor indeed afford its inhabitants any effective protection against foreign corporations and private merchants. The infinite variety of money, too, and the want of a strict statutory supervision of the various mints threw further obstacles in the way. The consequence was that foreign products had everywhere the advantage over the native. The state of the rural districts was even worse than that of the cities. In spite of all restrictions and obligations, the peasants, before the outbreak of the war, were, especially in West and South Germany, in a condition of material prosperity and comfort. Their houses, though simple in construction, were well provided with furniture and conveniences. They possessed many cattle, and horse breeding was carried on a more extensive scale than at present. The sheep yielded a fine, universally prized wool, which, when converted into cloths, formed a favourite article of export. The culture of the vine, too, was then common in many districts where it is no longer followed. But after 1618 all this changed. The peasant was first defrauded by the debasement of the currency, then came the burdensome taxes for war purposes, and finally the armies, as previously described, devastated and desolated everywhere. How, after the return of peace, were the wretched conditions to be even mitigated? The peasants' dwellings were in ruins, their cattle slaughtered or driven off, their orchards cut down, their furniture destroyed, their money gone. Many discharged soldiers did indeed again lay hold of the axe and plough, but they were often possessed by the wild unruly spirit engendered by war, and could not easily reconcile themselves to humdrum everyday village life. With the purpose of taming these turbulent elements, the greater landowners drew the bonds of vassalage even tighter, and the social relations of the peasants became more and more oppressive. The peasant vegetated, penned in like his cattle, kept in awe by his parson through the dread of hell fire, regularly shorn by his landlord and sovereign, or led off to the battlefield in his own or a foreign country. Nor did the landowners lie on beds of roses. They lived on their impoverished and wasted possessions, for the most part crushed down by debts and lawsuits. Loans by which to repair the ravages of war were difficult to obtain, and then only at exorbitant interest. Many nobles had to leave home and court, and attach themselves as satellites to their more fortunate brethren. Terrible as was Germany's material suffering from this cruel war, The intellectual and moral degeneracy was still worse. Pecuniary losses would have been made good with time, had the people's spiritual nature been left uncorrupted. But this was not so, and even at the present day the wounds that the 30 Years' War inflicted on German character are scarcely healed. A turbulent, gross, lawless temper, averse to work of any kind, took possession of all classes in the Empire. The life of a highwayman or a vagrant beggar was more congenial to many than the hard constraints of honest labour. In Bavaria and many other places, gipsies, swindlers, and vagabonds of all sorts swarmed in bands over the country. If the Elector determined to go on a pilgrimage, he had first, for his own safety, to send out scouring parties to clear the roads. Since no one was sure of the future, the rule was to make the most of the present. How could noble conceptions, refinement of manners, regard for what is sacred, and a taste for higher enjoyments, develop in a period of such vicissitude and barbarism? Nor did the wild manner of living disappear immediately after 1648. "The misery of the times," says one, "instead of bettering the people made them worse. Profligacy, impunity, and kindred vices became daily more rampant, and all efforts to check them were in vain. This is most clearly proved by the frequent and repeated ordinances against the desecration of Sunday and saints' days, dancing, drunken carousals, night brawls and clamour, cursing, fornication and adultery, excesses at marriages and feasts, etc. How universally did superstition and fanaticism gain the upper hand, while young and old showed the greatest indifference to religion." Such was the condition of Germany at the close of the 30 Years' War. The prevalent degeneracy was aggravated by the fact that the clergy suffered more than almost any other class through the war. On the ministers of an alien faith the soldiers fell with especial fury, and care for the souls of the sick carried off numbers during the pestilence. The devastation of many universities, combined with the poverty of most congregations, checked the supply of new candidates. Education, too, suffered scarcely less severely. How wretched the condition of the teachers was, is shown by ordinances issued in more places than one, interdicting the clergy from employing schoolmasters too often in their domestic service, as in sawing wood and threshing wheat. A seemingly paradoxical phenomenon of the times was boundless extravagance in dress and ornaments, and gluttonous excess in eating and drinking. Innumerable sumptuary laws show the prevalence of the evil, though they appear to have been without effect. In Leipzig the maid servants were summoned before the city council for wearing trains and laces forbidden to people of their class, and the gewgaws were torn from them. But such attempts to prevent extravagance were unsuccessful. People thought it better to squander what they possessed in luxury and riotous living than to let it fall into the hands of those who spared nothing. Even the priesthood shared this feeling, and promoted it by encouraging lavish display on high festivals. The higher classes set an example of prodigality and frivolity which found ready imitation among those beneath them. The workman's ancient pride in honest work vanished. The decadence of German manufactures, which had been wrongly ascribed to the modern system of economical freedom, took its origin in the 30 Years' War. The coarse scepticism and the struggle after merely material interests, characteristic of the epoch, were perfectly compatible with the densest superstition. The terrors amid which everyone lived beclouded the moral nature of even the best disposed, and delivered them over to the gloomy frenzy of delusion. Soldiers believed that they could fortify themselves by charms against the enemy's weapons. A whole literature gathered round this "black art," which was, however, recognised as coming from the devil, and as ultimately fatal to those who practised it. In no other age and country did the belief in witchcraft prevail so generally as in Germany at this time. As if the sword, fire, famine, and pestilence had not claimed victims enough, innumerable persons, especially women, fell victims to the popular delusion about witchcraft. The witch commissioners gained renown in proportion to the number of unfortunates whom they caused to be seized and burned. In every village a committee was appointed to bring new delinquents to trial. In 3 years, from 1627 to 1629, the Bishop of Würzburg caused 900 witches to be executed. Nor are we to believe that all these victims were convicted through confessions forced from them by torture. Probably the darkest feature in the whole matter was that many regarded themselves as actually guilty. The horrors of the time and the universal belief in this direful superstition produced hallucinations that convinced many women, young as well as old, that they really had dealings with the Evil One and had attended the "Witches' Sabbath." Even the Swedes, who came to Germany untainted by this superstition, became infected by the delusion and returned to kindle the fires of torture in their own land. It was only natural that the protracted civil war should destroy the last relics of national feeling still lingering in the hearts of the German people. These men who, with the help of foreigners, had for 30 years been slaughtering one another, no longer had a common fatherland. Was it possible for the Protestants to honour, as their Emperor and liege lord, that puppet of the Jesuits in Vienna, who was the cause of so much of their sufferings? Even the Catholics saw that these Habsburgs cared only for the power of their house, and not at all for the welfare or greatness of Germany. The feeling of national unity and loyalty for a national emperor was dead. Catholicism was popular, at most, only in Bavaria and some of the ecclesiastical principalities. On the other hand, the meanness, cowardice, and selfishness of the Protestant princes took from their fellow Protestants all confidence in them or pride in their cause. Ultimately the religious character of the war was thrust into the background, and the contest became entirely one of political selfishness. How could any feeling of nationality or even of local patriotism arise? Little could Germany do to withstand the influence of the foreign soldiers and foreign officers, with their male and female hangers on, who during the whole course of the war overflowed the land. The German does not have that hard, reserved nature which enables other nationalities to resist the effects of the introduction of foreign elements. Even in the Middle Ages the German nation had opened itself especially to French influences. How much more easy for such to find admission now that all national life, all community of feeling, all pride in country, were dead among the Germans. The manner of the foreigners was so confident and imposing, and they appeared so much gayer, richer, and happier, that the poor Germans readily believed that everything was better which came from them, and eagerly imitated them in their manners, speech, and fashions. The special assumption of French modes dates from 1626. Men then began to make themselves ridiculous by imitating the giant perukes of the French court. The beard that the beau up to this time had cultivated and cared for with extraordinary anxiety was now shaved off. The monster peruke hung like a cloud over the beardless face. In like manner the war mantle gave way to the overcoat, while the jerkin gradually shrank up into the vest. Naturally the modifications in the female attire were not behind those in the male, the most noticeable being the very low cut of the dresses, so as to expose the neck and bust. Unfortunately, this spirit of mimicry prevailed not only in regard to the foreigner, but also in the relations between the different ranks. Everyone cringed before his superiors, to lord it more arrogantly over his inferiors. The princes themselves saw in their subjects only flocks to be shorn to the uttermost. As if in contempt of the reputation of being good housefathers, so much coveted by their ancestors, they gave themselves up to revels and extravagances of all kinds. At the same time they endeavoured to appear as mighty monarchs, surrounded themselves with armies, made up perhaps only of a few parade soldiers, with regular courts composed of a host of ministers, privy councillors, and diplomats. For the welfare of his subjects, for a rational financial and civil administration, or for watchfulness over public or private morality, the Prince now cared nothing. The nobility flocked to his court and crowded in devotion around the ruler, that they might share in his brilliant and delightful existence, and be remembered with some portion of the spoil torn from the hapless subjects. Counting the collateral lines of the great princely houses, There were then in Germany at least 500 to 600 courtly households and 1,500 castles, where were found at least 6,000 court offices and charges; every one of them fell to the nobles. With smiles of devotion these unworthy flatterers bore the humours and insults of the despot and his favourites of either sex, or deliberately placed their wives and daughters as mistresses in his arms. Such men did not trouble themselves about their peasants. The collector of rent and the overseer of labour were all that these saw to remind them of their lord. If the latter chanced to return to his estate, his delight was to pose there as a little sovereign, to surround himself with stringent ceremonials, and to squander his means in splendid buildings and in personal indulgence. The burgher stood in silent awe, not only before the Prince, but before his functionaries and officers. He knew no higher ambition than to be admitted into the latter class, and possibly to be dignified with a title. The mania for ennoblement dates entirely from this period. The Imperial Court took advantage of it to fill its empty coffers by the sale of titles at a fixed tariff. As early as 1654 the Diet complained of this vicious practice. No wonder that all interest in municipal or communal affairs died out, and that maladministration prevailed. The wretched conditions of Germany were not without recognition at the time. This found expression in numberless pamphlets, which, as well as newspapers, were eagerly read. From the beginning of the 17th century newspapers had regularly increased in number in all parts of Germany and Austria. What they lacked in spirit and interest was abundantly supplied by the pamphlets, which exposed and criticised abuses and grievances boldly and incisively, but unfortunately did not have any remedies to propose. However, even during the dreary times of the war and in the following years, efforts at reform were not entirely lacking. There were a few able conscientious princes, such as Frederick William of Brandenburg, Charles Louis of the Palatinate, and Eberhard of Würtemberg, and some honest officials who thought more of the welfare of the people than of their own personal interests or the smile of the ruler, minister, or favourite. Many of the clergy too, Catholic as well as Protestant, by their piety and devoted self-sacrifice, made up in some measure for the evils that their mutual hatred had brought on the land. No department suffered more through the disorders of the war than that of learning. Professors and students vanished before the clash of arms, or became soldiers. Helmstadt in 1624 numbered 400 students. 2 years later its lecture rooms were empty, and its professors, with one solitary exception, had fled. In Heidelberg, in 1626, there were but 2 students. In Jena the number of newcomers was reduced to 2/3. The universal poverty deprived the university teachers of their bread. Many betook themselves to foreign lands, others perished in penury. Even among the youths who continued to study, an incredible grossness and brutality prevailed, the result of intercourse with the soldiery. The worst scholastic outrage was the pennalism, that is, the systematic abuse of the newcomers (pennals) by the older students (schoristen). These inhuman practices finally became so outrageous that the Diet felt compelled to intervene and enact severe penalties. The teaching itself was lifeless and pedantic, encumbered by the bonds of rigid orthodoxy and servile adherence to precedent. The professors were the first to introduce among their students the unworthy distinction of nobles and civilians. In the domains of secondary education, John Amos Comenius, 1592 1670, a Protestant preacher and teacher of Moravia, made an earnest attempt at reform. Driven from his native land by the counter Reformation, he led a wandering life in Germany, England, Sweden, Hungary, and Holland. His educational writings gained him great fame, but little gold. Unweariedly he preached a natural and God-fearing system of education as the best cure for the moral disease of the time. Up to this time, and later also, eloquence had formed the main subject of study. His foundation principle was that a knowledge of things should precede the study of works, Therefore an acquaintance with actual objects, as those of nature, science, and art, should precede the study of dialectics and rhetoric, so that these might not be a mere word play without substance and meaning. It is to be regretted that the French fashion of the times and the incapacity of the teachers suffered the seeds sown by Comenius to die without bearing fruit. Nor was the German love for investigation and practical invention entirely quenched by the 30 Years' War. In 1650 Otto van Guericke invented the air pump, and 4 years later he demonstrated its efficiency before the Diet of Ratisbon by the experiment of the Magdeburg hemispheres, so called from Guericke being Mayor of Magdeburg. Besides this, he constructed the first manometer and electrical machine. Even the princes occupied themselves much with such experiments, often, however, not so much from an interest in science as from their bent toward alchemy and similar cabalistic studies. But on the whole, Germany could not keep pace with Italy, France, the United Provinces, and England in their extraordinary advances in the sciences. German students in these branches had to seek instruction in foreign universities or from the writings of foreigners. Intellectual efforts found there neither the sympathy of large classes of the community, as in England, Italy, and Holland, nor the steadfast support of a powerful sovereign, as in France. Practical inventions were not encouraged and fostered by a wealthy and enterprising commercial class, so that the main incentive to making them was wanting. Nor were the consequences of the protracted war less disastrous to the religious life. The scant germs of improvement which had shown themselves towards the end of the period immediately preceding it, were choked. In the Protestant lands nothing prevailed but a lifeless adherence to the letter; in the Catholic, the Jesuits, with their rigid formalism and tyranny over the intellect, had all power in their hands, while the learned, as we have seen, were either pedants or sought stimulation in foreign lands. With delight men gave themselves up to the seductive charm of France, particularly in the Protestant territories which were more closely associated with their western neighbours. The German Calvinists maintained a lively intercourse with their French brethren, who being discountenanced and sometimes even persecuted at home, settled in considerable numbers in the congenial German lands. The Catholic districts, on the other hand, found themselves once more in connection with Italy and Spain, and accepted their fashions, customs, and speech. French, Italian, and Spanish expressions made their way into the German language in such profusion that it was soon saturated with Latin elements. The result was that it lost much of its native character, and, especially in the eagerly read newspapers, became a confused medley of tongues. In vain did writers of the better sort bewail the evil, and satirists deride it. Even special societies were instituted for the maintenance of the purity of the language, but the intellectual poverty and want of literary endowments on the part of most of the members made it impossible for them to exercise any effective influence. That poetry kept itself pure from this confusion of tongues and other affectations was due chiefly to the fact that the national New High German poetry had its origin at this time under the auspices of so clear-sighted and patriotic a man as Martin Opitz. This poet, born in 1597 at Bunzlau in Silesia, was a man who had educated himself not only by a thorough study of the classics in the schools and universities, but also by intercourse with highly gifted associates, and a long sojourn in the free Netherlands. A journey to Paris also contributed to liberalize his mind and polish his taste. He early became famous, and was crowned as Poet Laureate by Emperor Ferdinand II. Chosen to be secretary and court historiographer by the King of Poland, he died in 1639 of the plague. With justice he bears the name of "Father of New High German Poetry." His earlier poems show a freshness and an originality of genius, which he later sacrificed too much to smoothness of form and a slavish imitation of foreign models. His didactic poems we admire chiefly for their occasional descriptions of nature and the power of observation they show. His tragedies, pastoral plays, and operas are long since forgotten, but they had a stimulating effect on his own and the immediately succeeding age. It is noteworthy that, at the same time with Opitz, an eminent Catholic author, Frederick von Spee, in the introduction to his book of songs, the Trutznachtigall, was contending for the essential principles of Opitz, especially for the avoidance of every foreign or even affected expression. More than Opitz he shunned all leaning toward foreigners, and his songs, glowing with a fervid but mystical piety, show more true feeling and strike a more popular note than those of his cooler and more restrained contemporary. Himself a noble and lovable Jesuit father, he exhibits the beautiful and attractive side of the life of the Catholic orders. He was the first in Europe to protest in his book, Cautio Criminalis, 1631, against the atrocious persecution of witches, and he met with success. In accordance with the religious disposition of the time, the Protestant hymnology made itself rather more widely acceptable than the Catholic, and there is a most interesting development in that direction. John Herman, with his beautiful hymns, was a great comforter of poor and afflicted people. More profound and yet more popular than Herman was Paul Gerhardt. Never were the relations of the individual to his Creator more fervently and more effectively depicted than in his sacred songs, several of which have become German classics. Secular poetry found a worthy representative in the greatest poet of the time, Paul Fleming. Born in 1609, in a parsonage among the mountains which separate Saxony from Bohemia, Fleming attained in his youth a position in the diplomatic service of the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein, and took part in an embassy to Moscow. He then studied medicine in Leipzig, and settled as a physician in Hamburg, where he died in 1640. Fleming came into personal contact with Opitz, and all his life regarded him as his master, but surpassed him in genuine feeling. How sincere and warm an interest he took in the sad fate of his countrymen, and how deeply he deplored their degeneracy, are shown in his lamentation over the "changing and timidity of the present Germans." How keenly he felt for their literary fame, in his poem "Against the Contemners of German Poetry." If Fleming was the greatest German poetical genius of his time, Andreas Gryphius was the most versatile. Like Opitz, he was a Silesian, born in 1616, and like him made several tours abroad. Alternately a teacher and an executive officer of the respectable class, he died in his native city in 1664. A sad personal life and the afflictions of his fatherland have given a melancholy character to most of Gryphius's creations. In contrast with Opitz, Gryphius's lyrical pieces express his feelings with great truth and directness, but often with rudeness and in violation of the rules of poetical expression. His comedies are based on actual conditions and express the views of the people, but are often characterized by a rude comic power and unvarnished naturalness. Till Lessing, nothing so good as Gryphius's comedies, appeared in this branch of literature. The popular bent that shows itself in Gryphius's comedies is obvious also in the satirists. The Silesian, Frederick von Logau, is without doubt the leading epigrammatic poet of Germany. Power and pungency of expression, coupled with a light, airy grace, are finely and wittily united in him. As in the case of many patriotic writers of the period, a frequent subject for his scorn is the predominance of foreign, especially of French, influence. Though poetry, thanks to the efforts of Opitz and Spee, had well maintained itself, prose had fallen to such a low level as to threaten the very existence of the language, but two prose authors kept it alive by avoiding the general Babel-like corruption, Moscherosch and Grimmelshausen. Moscherosch, an able Alsatian administrative officer and statesman, following the example of the Spanish Quevedo, lashed the errors and vices of his time in his "Wonderful and True Visions of Philander of Zietewald." His wit, scathing as it is, always echoes the sorrows of his soul. His works were unfortunately too little adapted for the general public to become the common property of the whole nation, and this was also the case with the popular romances of Christopher von Grimmelshausen, especially his renowned "Simplicissimus," the truest, most comprehensive, and at the same time the most captivating picture of contemporaneous conditions existing in German literature. To this day they are read with the same interest with which they were read 2 centuries ago, and probably with much more instruction. We do not hesitate to pronounce the Adventuresome Simplicissimus the greatest and most enduring production of the German intellect in the 17th century. Art during the period of storm and stress perished utterly. Every condition essential to its existence was lacking: security, wealth, national aspirations, and common traditions. And this at a period when in the Netherlands painting had developed on so magnificent a scale and so distinctively that Brabant and Holland almost took their place by the side of Italy. The Brabant school recognized as its founder and greatest master Peter Paul Rubens (1577 1640). This illustrious and many-sided genius had freed himself from the fetters of the Mannerists that were predominant at home, by a personal study of the great Italian artists of the 15th century and especially of the Venetians. The Venetian gorgeousness of colouring and skill in drawing are employed by him to express exuberant strength and joy of life. Delicate natures may be repelled by an occasional obtrusive sensuousness, but his matchless massing of figures and his masterly drawing are overpowering. His works are the most beautiful embodiment of the nature of the Low Countries, with all its excellencies as well as its defects. Ecclesiastical and profane history, animals and portraits, children and landscapes, all formed subjects for his pencil and brush. Rubens's greatest disciple, Anthony van Dyck, was of an entirely different nature. He had nothing of the master's superabundance of power, nor of his glowing genius, but was refined, sensitive, and without great inward force or self-reliance. At first he was a close imitator of Rubens. Then, on his visit to Italy, the Venetian masters had such an influence upon him that his productions are scarcely to be distinguished from theirs. Finally, as court painter to Charles I of England, he exhibits, in his portraits of the aristocratic court circle, wonderful delicacy of conception, touch, and colour. In descriptive pictures he shows a preference for subjects from the New Testament, which he treated with great feeling. No one among the great Brabant painters gives less expression to the sturdy character of the Low Countries than this delineator of the English nobility. To the brilliancy and richness of colouring and the aristocratic joy in pomp and splendour of the Brabant school, the masters of homely, republican Holland were strangers. But in common with it, they had a keen feeling for what is real, they identified themselves affectionately with nature, they possessed a faculty for vigorous execution and accurate study of details. In these Protestant lands, which broke with church traditions, art began with simple portraiture and landscapes. In these two branches Van der Helst, and especially Frank Hals, distinguished themselves by likenesses characterized by breadth and boldness of touch. Franz Snyders, with power and talent, depicts hunting and battle scenes. John Van Hoyen founded, in a simple and pleasing way, the landscape school, where the favourite scenes are the wide spreading, well watered plains of his fatherland. In these subjects he was followed by his scholars. And then came the master, Rembrandt van Rijn, 1607 1669, who combined in himself all the tendencies of his predecessors, and carried them higher and farther. Rembrandt began by slavishly copying his models, without advancing from them to nobler and more beautiful forms. But his genius soon asserted itself, and while he always took nature as his teacher, he strove to idealize her and to bring out the living principle concealed in her. Wonderful are his light effects, sometimes clear and dazzling, sometimes in soft chiaroscuro. The great painter knew how to inspire even the most trifling objects with life. Like Rubens, he was many-sided in the subjects of his art, but he had no taste for mythology, and treated it only from a coarse, comic point of view. Rembrandt belonged to that class of geniuses who are so supremely original that they leave no disciples. But the Dutch school continued to develop independently, particularly in landscape painting. In this the tone was given by Jacob Ruysdael (1625 1682), an artist of the first rank. Nature worked on his spirit with a deep and often passionate effect, and yet his creations show a subtle knowledge of the laws of perspective and correct and delicate drawing. A spirit of melancholy seems to pervade the unique creations of this great painter poet, who writes elegies upon canvas. A pure creation of the Netherlands is the modern school of genre painting, which has never been equalled, either in freshness and originality of conception, or in delicacy of execution. The founder of this school was Peter Bruegel, who lived at the end of the 16th century. In the hands of the younger Bruegel and the elder David Teniers, it threatened to take a fantastic and extravagant turn, often verging on the absurd. The younger David Teniers (1610 1690) restored it to its proper domain. He is indeed the true creator of the low life genre painting of the Dutch school. He elevates the most vulgar subjects by his fine sense of humour, his masterly colouring, and dexterous light effects, and infuses a spirit of poetry into the most ordinary events of everyday life. Gerard Terburg (1608 1681) was the gifted painter of the life of the higher classes, whom he shows in all their splendour and dignity, the stately, richly bedecked gentlemen, and the dames rustling in white silken robes and flashing with costly jewellery. Terburg, the first of this school, was also the best. Next to him ranks the somewhat younger Gerard Dow, and the two were the predecessors of a long series of workers in the same field. What a wonderful race was this little people of the Netherlands! The same generation that produced numerous painters of the first and second rank brought Dutch literature to its highest stage of perfection, a stage never again to be reached. Amsterdam was at this time the literary centre, where Hooft, Vondel, and Huygens worked together. Peter Hooft (1581 1647), a scion of an illustrious patrician family, had cultivated his taste by many long foreign tours. His object was to combine the charm of Italian expression with the northern richness of thought. Thus he was the father of Dutch prose and poetry. It must, however, be acknowledged that in the latter field he showed less originality than he did as historian of his country. Jost van den Vondel (1587 1679) justly enjoys the fame of being the first lyric poet of Holland, while as a dramatist he became a mere imitator of French models. Finally, Constantine Huygens, father of the renowned physicist, distinguished himself as an historian, but his poems have sunk into oblivion. More popular was Jacob Cats (1577 1660), a Zeelander who plays an important part in the public affairs of the United Netherlands. His writings, spoken of as "the Book of Father Cats," held their place, along with the Bible, for centuries in the Dutch and Flemish homes. Holland's renown for classical philology was maintained by such men as Heinsius, Hugo Grotius, Rutgers, and Vossius. This country was, indeed, at that time regarded as the true fatherland of learning. Meursius founded the study of Greek antiquities, Erpenius of Gorkum and Holius raised the study of Arabic to the rank of science. On the original and suggestive discoveries of Kepler in regard to the eye, the Dutch based others of a practical nature. Jens Lippershey, a spectacle maker of Middelburg, devised the telescope in 1608, Cornelius van Drebel the microscope. About 1620, Willebrord Snell discovered the law of the refraction of light. The great jurist, Hugo Grotius, Hugo de Groot, the father of international law, was born at Delft in 1583. As a child he attracted the notice of his country and of foreign potentates, and at the age of 15 received a golden chain from Henry IV of France. His sympathy for the Armenians brought him into prison, but his self-sacrificing wife was successful in bringing about his escape. He fled first to France, then to Sweden, whence he went as Swedish ambassador to Paris. On his return towards Sweden he was overtaken by death at Rostock in 1645. He was a many-sided man, thoroughly versed in classical lore. His literary labours were by no means confined to jurisprudence. He composed also theological, historical, and philosophical treatises, as well as poetry. His book, De Veritate Religionis Christianae, concerning the truth of the Christian religion, is regarded as the best of the later defences of Christianity. But his greatest work, and that by which he has won undying fame, is his Three Books concerning the Law of War and Peace, De Jure Belli et Pacis Libri Tres, 1625. This great work marked a new epoch in international relations, one might say in politics, because it sets forth for the first time the system of international law. It is characterized not only by a truly philosophical spirit and a humanity rarely found in those days, but also by the strictest scientific treatment, absolute freedom from party spirit, and a dignified and judicial calmness elevated above all the influences of the time. It at once claimed and received the most marked attention, and even to day it is by no means obsolete. The life of Holland in the 17th century, civic, religious, and artistic, was sound and vigorous, and in melancholy contrast to that of the kindred race in Germany during and after the 30 Years' War. Spain, also the adversary of Holland, was in a state of rapid and constant decay. As early as the beginning of the reign of Philip IV, a member of the Cortes had presented a memorial to him which summarized the sad condition of the country as follows: "Many places are depopulated and forsaken, the churches dilapidated, the houses in ruins, estates lost, the fields uncultivated, the inhabitants, with wives and children, on the highways wandering from place to place in search of work, nourishing themselves with the grasses and roots of the fields. Others emigrate to lands where the subjects are not crushed down by taxes." The well-meant attempts at reform by the Count Duke Olivares were effectually frustrated by the many constant wars which the King believed himself compelled to undertake for the maintenance of religion and the glory of the "illustrious House of Austria." Herein the nation and the nobles were of the one mind with their ruler. They still looked upon Spain as the first country of the world. Wars were waged in Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Catalonia, Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, and Franche Comté. The burdens of war were all the more intolerable in that, since the expulsion of the Moors, industry and commerce had been half paralysed. Furthermore, trade with all the lands with which Spain was at war, that is, with half of Europe, was forbidden for her people. At the same time, the wars emptied the public coffers and necessitated continual loans. The revenue, which in 1634 amounted to 18 million ducats, of which only 7 million had to be expended to pay the interest on the national debt, was now almost entirely swallowed up in paying the interest on and redeeming the national loans. If Olivares, to raise money, suddenly doubled the nominal value of the metallic currency, or to make handiwork cheaper made the sale of grain compulsory at prices fixed by authority, his measures only increased the evil. As the land became poorer, the imposts rose higher, for the war swallowed incredible sums. Already Olivares, in despair at the drying up of the regular sources of revenue, had appealed to the magnanimity of private persons. While the minister was scarcely able to bear up longer under the burden of affairs, the King's mind was occupied with amusements of all sorts, festivals, ballets, bullfights, theatrical performances. The authority of the Cortes, like that of the monarch, was only nominal, for Philip always signed whatever Olivares laid before him. One thing is certain, the minister thought only of the real good of the State, and neither enriched himself nor allowed those around him to enrich themselves. With a firm hand he held the grandees in check, and permitted them neither to plunder nor defraud the country. On the other hand, they were free to indulge in enjoyments of all kinds, for which the King set the example. Sexual immorality was almost universal in Spain. From it resulted brawls, abductions, and assassinations without number. In Madrid alone 110 murders occurred within 1 week. For 2 decades Olivares maintained himself as uncontrolled master of Spain. Then, when his overstrained system of rule broke down, when Portugal and Catalonia rose in revolt, when France was winning victory after victory in the Netherlands and in Italy, and when State bankruptcy became inevitable, the blame for all these misfortunes was heaped on his head. The Queen, Isabella of Bourbon, whose private life was not above suspicion, placed herself at the head of the enemies of Olivares, and at length, in January, 1633, just a month after Richelieu's death, prevailed upon the weak and irresolute monarch to banish his favourite to his estates. The joy at Olivares' overthrow was universal. A placard was found attached to the gate of the royal palace saying, "Now thou wilt be Philip the Great indeed, for the Count Duke will no longer make thee little." The short-sighted multitude always believes that a change will bring a better state of affairs. It was probably fortunate for Olivares that, a year and a half later, death removed him beyond the power of his enemies. His best vindication is that matters became worse in Spain after his fall. At first the King, to the joy of his loyal subjects, declared his purpose of conducting the government himself, but as he had little success, and, through the death of his Queen and of the heir apparent, Balthazar Charles, was left without family life, he fell back into his former wasteful and dissolute habits. His increasing sickliness, aggravated, as in the case of most of the members of the House of Austria, by immoderate eating, decided him to give up the conduct of public affairs and entrust them to Don Luis de Haro, a well-meaning but only moderately gifted minister. Friendly and complaisant to everyone, he was above all a man of peace, but in spite of his good will he had little practical ability, and was little acquainted with foreign affairs. In the deplorable condition of Spain, even a great genius could scarcely have changed matters for the better. A navy was no longer maintained, for it would have become merely a spoil for her enemies. Her merchant marine, on account of the prohibition of intercourse with England, France, Venice, and Portugal, had practically ceased to exist. The incessant changes in the value of money, the wretched condition of the highways, and the exorbitant taxes, destroyed whatever was left of the domestic trade of Spain. Her moral degeneration more than kept pace with her material decadence. All was corrupt, from the minister and viceroy down to the village bailiff, and from the general to the sergeant. No wonder that the unpaid soldiery renounced their service, that every man regarded the State, that made such inordinate demands, as his enemy, for which he ought to do nothing voluntarily, but which he was justified in defrauding to the utmost of his ability. Literature and art alone were not affected by the general spirit of decay. One of the favourite amusements of the Court was dramatic representations, in which the Queen herself and the princesses took part. Indeed, the dramatic instinct was deep rooted among the people. In the beginning of the 17th century, Lope de Vega stood on the pinnacle of his fame, but was shortly displaced by Pedro Calderón de la Barca (1600 1681). Calderón wrote comedies, dramas, tragedies, and sacred plays (autos), all with the same richness of thought, fertility of imagination, and ease of versification. Calderón's forte does not lie in subtle delineation of individual character, but he knows how to let the voice of nature speak out clear and true, even in its deepest, most exciting, and most affecting tones. The Spain of his time, especially that of the higher orders, with their sensitive feeling of honour, their reckless courage, their pomp of speech, their love for gallant adventures, and their unbounded devotion to the churches, lives, acts, and speaks before us in the works of this poet. But there was not only dramatic poetry. The brothers Argensola were eminently happy in their imitations of Horace, showing taste, clearness, and a feeling for pictorial beauty. Quevedo wrote his satirical visions and comic romances such as The History and Life of the Great Sharper. Vieja's love songs are not destitute of charm, but they are marred by exaggerated and forced expressions and figures. Luis de Góngora sedulously developed this far-fetched, affected manner, the cultivated style, and thus became the founder of a formal school known as Gongorists. No word preserved its natural sense, no sentence its natural structure, no thought received natural expression; all was novel, inverted, forced into unusual forms, mixed up with foreign-like elements, and embellished with monstrous metaphors. Thus the inauguration of the rapid decadence of Spanish literature falls immediately after the period of its proudest bloom, in the time of Philip IV, who himself took a lively interest in the poetry of the "culturists." The King interested himself also in painting, and was a frequent visitor in the studios of the great artists who then raised Spanish painting to its height. Their art was characterized by an ardent religious feeling, full surrender of self to the divine, monkish asceticism, consuming zeal for the faith, such are the favourite subjects of the Spanish artists, whose work is marked by strong colouring and skill in gradation of shades. They stand upon the shoulders of the Venetians, whose types they modify in a way to make them national. De las Roelas and Francisco Herrera were the first to implant these tendencies in the school of Seville; Francisco Zurbarán (1592 1662) the first to give them full expression. From the same school came Diego Velázquez de Silva (1599 1660), a Sevillan, though his exact study of the Netherlanders and his long sojourn in Italy enabled him to break the bonds in which his fellow artists lay, and gave him a wider range. The silvery, airy colouring, peculiar to him, diffuses a charm of sentiment over his pictures. Landscapes, genre pieces, as well as religious subjects, occupied his brush, till his career was ultimately determined by Philip IV appointing him his court painter. After this he devoted himself to painting the portraits of persons of eminence, and this work, in his hands, acquired a more dignified, imposing, and noble character than in those of the Netherlanders. In colouring, Velázquez combined the excellencies of the Venetian and Netherland schools. He and Murillo, who was born 2 decades later, constitute the most brilliant double star in the artistic firmament of Spain. Sculpture too was transplanted to Spain by the admirable Berruguete in the first half of the 16th century, and found there, especially in the south, a race of zealous devotees, reaching down to the present day. The chief names are those of Montañez (died 1649), an artist of the first rank, and his more famous pupil, Alonso Cano of Granada (1601 1667), who, like Michelangelo, was sculptor, architect, and painter, having studied painting in Seville. Philip IV brought him, while still a young man, to court, appointing him superintendent of the royal edifices and court painter. He was especially eminent as a carver of captivatingly beautiful statuettes in painted wood. Thus literature and art gilded the waning greatness of Spain, and lent to its death throes something grand and attractive. Spanish science had long since died in the stifling embrace of the Inquisition. End of Part 1 of Europe in the Middle of the 17th Century by Martin Philipson. Part 2 of Europe in the Middle of the 17th Century by Martin Philipson, from The History of All Nations from Earliest Times, Volume 13, The Age of Louis XIV, translated under the supervision of John Henry Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr Natter. Italy was, in many respects, in political dependence on Spain, and yet the two countries were very different from each other in their intellectual and social development. The victory of the exclusive and persecuting party in the Catholic Church had indeed impeded the intellectual advance of Italy, but had not fully checked it. For this the country was mainly indebted to the growing mildness of disposition, especially among the better orders, which imperceptibly removed their weapons from the hands of the Inquisitors. After a moment of grim and bloody reaction, the whole nation, even the priesthood, gave itself up too completely to the soft charms of art and poetry to think any longer of heresy hunts and autos da fe. The fact, too, that the petty tyrants gradually disappeared, and made room for an ampler national life, in which truer ideas of statesmanship were comprehended and realized, contributed still further to humanize popular manners. Though criticism of religion and the State was severely punished, intellectual and spiritual development was not systematically restricted as in Spain, but was instead fostered under the sure but mild guardianship of laws, impartially dispensed and observed by absolute but not despotic rulers. The whole people, even the very poorest and most ignorant, were carried away with enthusiasm over the productions of the great poets and artists of the 16th century, and promised their successors honour and wealth. When the dread of a great Franco-Spanish war vanished on the death of Henry IV of France, and the peace-loving Philip III ruled in Spain, a period of quiet and happy development seemed to dawn for Italy. Even the Spanish administration in Naples, under Lemos and Osuna, encouraged study. The University of that city, enlarged and improved by accession of professors from all the rest of Italy, once more acquired an authoritative place in the domain of learning. The hope of such a period of peaceful prosperity was not fully realized. The restless ambitions of Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, the long protracted Valtelline affair, and later the war for the Mantuan succession, disturbed the repose of North Italy, but Central and Lower Italy enjoyed nearly a half century of peace, which was rarely broken. The only person who occasionally interrupted this condition was Urban VIII, who seemed to desire to revive the papal policy of the first half of the 16th century. He combated the German and Spanish Habsburgs, though they were the champions of Catholicism against heresy. An open rupture occurred on this point in the College of Cardinals, and amid the applause of the gathering, a Borgia was bold enough to charge the Pope with religious indifference, a charge echoed by the outer world. His nepotism too was notorious. Many bulls of his predecessors forbade the endowment of relatives of the Pope with principalities and other high offices at the cost of the Church. Nevertheless, the Barberini were now laden with such dignities and with unmeasured wealth. With their greatly swollen revenues, the relatives of Urban VIII were able to purchase the ancient fiefs of the Colonna, Orsini, Sforza, and other illustrious families. With a view to prolonging the influence of his kin beyond his own life, Urban conferred on them 42 cardinalates. Finally, that nothing might be wanting to recall conditions so little in accord with the age, Urban VIII, like an Alexander VI or a Julius II, again took up the plan of conquering the world. Of all the principalities that had been carved out of the States of the Church, everyone had been reabsorbed, save only Urbino, of which the Della Rovere, the family of Julius II, were rulers. Their sway was mild and favourable to art. Here Raphael had been born and received his initiation into art, Bembo had taken up his abode here, and on the little Umbrian state there still lingered, as it were, the afterglow of the 16th century. Duke Francis Maria II, now old and childless, could no longer offer effectual resistance to Urban when he demanded the admission of Papal troops into his fortresses. When the Prince died in 1631, the Church forthwith took possession of the land, much to the sorrow of its inhabitants. This success emboldened Urban to proceed with open violence against another family which owed its position to Papal nepotism, the Farnese. This race, descended from Pope Paul III, ruled over not a papal but an imperial fief, namely Parma. Duke Odoardo, a coarse, passionate, and unpopular man, held also the Duchy of Castro in the States of the Church. The Barberini craved it, while the Pope hoped to unite Parma and Piacenza with the States of the Church. Under entirely frivolous pretexts, his soldiers in 1641 occupied Castro, and in 1642 Urban put the Duke under the ban of the Church. But Odoardo Farnese found support in the other Italian princes, who for a long time had been incensed over the grasping policy of the Holy See. There was scarcely a state that Urban had not, in his arrogance, insulted, but a short time before he had laid the senators of the peaceful little Republic of Lucca under excommunication, because it had dared to punish with imprisonment the robber brother of a cardinal. The Republic had turned for protection to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. This prince, Cosmo II, was resolved to endure no further act of violence on the part of the Pontiff, and organized an alliance for the protection of the Farnese, of which the Este of Modena, as well as Venice, were members. War broke out between these secular powers and the head of the Church. Urban VIII, however, in the spring of 1644, was ready to sign a disadvantageous peace, which set Odoardo free from excommunication and replaced him in Castro. This humiliating defeat showed the weakness of the power of the Pope, who soon afterward, in July 1644, died. The situation was but little improved under his successor Innocent X. The Barberini, notwithstanding the number of their creatures, were unable to procure the choice of one of their own family by the conclave, and had therefore consented to the election of Giovanni Battista Pamphili, which, from the slight importance of his family and from his age, 72 years, seemed to imply no menace. But the family of the new Pope, precisely on the account of their lowly condition, were determined to enrich themselves as quickly as possible, and this could best be effected at the cost of the universally hated Barberini, who therefore had to leave Rome, their offices, palaces, and wealth, as a prey to the new house. As they had favoured France, the new government took the side of Spain, and a complete change of policy was the consequence. A reconciliation was effected with the Italian States, especially with Venice and the Medici, but the internal misrule remained unchanged. Personally, Innocent X was honourable, well-meaning, and industrious, and earnestly sought to restore order and justice in his dominions, but he was weak with age, and so completely subservient to his relatives, that nepotism under him was as scandalous as under his predecessor. Only one ray of fortune gilded his rule. Odoardo Farnese so misused his success in regard to Castro, and made himself so universally hated, that Innocent was able to take forcible possession of the contested fief without the new Duke, Ranuncio II, finding any support in the other Italian princes. Otherwise, the grey-haired Pontiff was so afflicted and perpetually irritated by the turmoils and unseemly dealings of his family, as to become a burden both to himself and to others. Innocent died in 1655, to his own relief and that of all the world. Under such popes the high office conferred little authority, whether ecclesiastical or political. The great religious wars had been decided without the co-operation of the popes, nay, almost contrary to their wishes. The papal administration was wretched. Debts were so enormous that the interest upon them swallowed up the whole income of the Papal States, so that the cost of the court, the executive, and the army had to be met by the Pope's ecclesiastical income and constant new loans. The nobles, once warlike and fired with the spirit of enterprise, were now utterly effeminate and cared only for pomp, titles, magnificent palaces, and multitudes of idle servants. Such extravagances had lessened power and multiplied debts. The old mediaeval families were thrust more and more into the background before the papal families of plebeian origin, the Borghese, Chigi, Pamphili, and Barberini. These led a brilliant life in the capital, constituted a formal court, set the fashion for Rome, and exercised the most important influence in the election of new popes. The government of the Church was, in consequence, more uniform, milder, weaker, and more inclined to peace. Of the other Italian states, Tuscany, in its peaceful and uneventful quietude, comes scarcely at all into notice, Genoa but little, Venice somewhat more, Savoy most of all. The Republic of Genoa had, through the reform measures of 1575 and 1576, acquired a degree of freedom such as was scarcely to be found elsewhere in Europe. The privileged classes had become so comprehensive as to include every well-to-do citizen. The power of the different magistracies was accurately defined. Personal freedom and liberty of speech were practically unlimited. But the Genoese government seemed to have abrogated tyranny and exclusive privileges only to fall into lethargy and weakness. A revolt of the Popolani, the democracy, was planned in 1628 with the connivance of, and with promises of help from Duke Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, their aim being the murder of the Senate and nobles and the establishment of a thoroughly democratic regime. But the conspiracy was discovered shortly before the contemplated outbreak and punished by the execution of the ringleaders. One can still see, running in a wide curve along the heights which enclose the city, the powerful forts then erected for the defence against the Savoyard. Shortly afterward peace was restored, and for half a century Genoa was at liberty to engage in commerce and financial transactions in perfect peace. Venice had so far as possible maintained its policy of peace, but was always opposed to its three ancient adversaries, the Church, the House of Habsburg, and the Turks. The Papacy, by repeated illegal demands, caused constant friction with the Venetian authorities. The chief sensation was caused by the murderous assaults made on Fra Paolo Sarpi, the undaunted Servite monk, who had fearlessly come forward as the champion of national independence against papal aggrandizement, and had been the ecclesiastical counsellor of the Senate in its strides in the years 1606 and 1607. In October 1607 the daggers of the assassins actually struck him, but he did not receive a mortal wound. As the assassins escaped to the States of the Church, and there went about, not only unmolested, but boasting of their deed, people agreed with Sarpi himself in thinking that this was perpetrated stilo Romane Curiae, with the stylus, dagger of the Roman Curia. The Venetian Senate protected and honoured its theologian after his recovery, a course of action which again gave great offence in Rome. Sarpi died in 1623. Venice seemed to be still more seriously threatened by the machinations of Spain. The House of Habsburg had good ground for being displeased with the Republic, which had for years carried on war with the rulers of Austria on account of the frontier district, Friuli, and had besides made it possible, through subsidies, for the Duke of Savoy to defend himself against the assaults of Spain in 1616 and 1617. In September of the latter year a general peace had been concluded. A Spanish dignitary soon appeared, however, who endeavoured to nullify the effects of the treaty. This was Duke of Osuna, Viceroy of Naples, who was assured of the protection of the then all-powerful Minister Uceda. He maintained, at the expense of the poor Neapolitans, a considerable force, and built in hot haste a large fleet. From all sides Venice had warning that Osuna had designs upon her. One of Osuna's officials had repeatedly exclaimed, "This year the Venetians will receive the finest drubbing." At length Osuna sent a number of warships under his own flag into the Adriatic, a sea that the Venetians had been wont to regard as a part of their dominions. It was maintained that he would have landed troops in the city had not the premature disclosure of his plan prevented its accomplishment. Meanwhile a pirate from Normandy, by the name of Jacob Pierre, had gone over from the Neapolitan service to the Venetian, and had, by pretending to reveal Osuna's secret plans, endeavoured to secure an important position for himself. But he was suspected of being in collusion with Osuna, and his communication was regarded as designed to deceive the Signory. The suspicion was well founded, for Pierre had recruited numerous mercenaries who were to rise as soon as the fleet appeared at the mouth of the lagoon. The whole scheme was completely foiled. First, Osuna's fleet, which attacked the Venetian fleet in time of peace, was utterly defeated near Santa Croce. Then some of the parties to the plot disclosed it to the Venetian authorities. The ringleaders were arrested (May, 1618), whereupon hundreds of their accomplices fled to Naples. The Spanish Government desired to disavow Osuna's schemes, now that they had failed, and he was recalled. Deeply moved at seeing his hopes thus shattered, the Duke resolved on resistance, and on making himself independent in Naples. With a view to gaining support, he attempted in 1620 to form an alliance with the Republic whose ruin he had vowed. Venice would have nothing to do with his intrigues, and Osuna, deserted by his soldiers, had to take ship for Spain, where he was cast into prison, and where he died 4 years later. In Venice no one believed in the non-complicity of Spain, and the Republic opposed both the Spaniards and the Emperor in the Mantuan War of Succession in 1628, but very ineffectively. Gustavus Adolphus received from her a subsidy against the Emperor, but in the following Franco-Spanish contest she deemed it more prudent to maintain a discreet neutrality. The circumstances prompted this policy. First the Turkish War, next the ever increasing disintegration in the Venetian state. The reciprocal plunderings and conflicts of the ships of the Barbary powers on the one hand, and those of Malta and Leghorn on the other, were constantly producing complications from which Venice, on account of her possessions and garrisons in Crete and the Archipelago, could not keep herself free. In the spring of 1645 over 50,000 Turks landed in Crete and began the conquest of the rich island. The fleets which the Italian States sent to its relief showed themselves as unwarlike and cowardly as the Italian armies of the period. The mercenaries of the Republic, on the other hand, mostly Germans and French, fought with determined courage, and delayed for 22 years the surrender of the besieged capital, Candia. The long and embittered struggle scarcely did more to weaken the Republic than the corruption which ate deeper and deeper into its heart. Failing means, with growing luxury, increasing effeminacy, and the spread of unmanly and unpatriotic sentiments, combined to introduce a spirit of venality, treachery, and mistrust among the leading nobles themselves, which threatened the very existence of the State founded on this aristocracy. Elections were now determined not by merit but by bribery, so that the public offices fell more and more exclusively into the hands of a few rich families. Several of the highest officials of the State were convicted of participation in Osuna's plot, and executed or sent to prolonged imprisonment. Besides well-grounded accusations, denunciations of innocent people from hate or avidity were frequent, and often led to their unjust condemnation. Under these conditions the prestige of the Republic necessarily waned, and its administration became more and more corrupt. The most famous among these false accusations was that which caused the death of Antonio Foscarini. This man, descended from one of the most respected patrician families of the city, after completing an excellent course of study, served his country in several important offices. While ambassador to England, he fell into strife with his secretary, Muscorno, a vain ambitious man who wished to be ambassador himself. Since Foscarini would not give way to him, Muscorno went to Venice and accused the ambassador of dishonourable and treacherous conduct. Foscarini was recalled, put to trial, but after 3 years was acquitted. His calumniator was condemned to 2 years' confinement in a fortress. Foscarini seemed fully cleared of suspicion. He became a senator and was again entrusted with important political negotiations. But scarcely was Muscorno at liberty, when, with a hatred quickened by thirst of revenge, he began again to labour for the ruin of his enemy, and this time with success. He made use of Foscarini's intimate relations with an Englishwoman of high rank, the Countess of Arundel, whose house was a rendezvous for diplomatists, to accuse him of entering into traitorous correspondence with foreign powers through intermediaries. Since Foscarini would not acknowledge any intimate relations with the Countess, he would not satisfactorily account for his frequent secret visits to her house, and he was condemned and hanged. 4 months later his innocence was proved. His main accuser, a certain Vano, with one of his accomplices, suffered death, and the memory of Foscarini was, with much formal ceremony, pronounced unsullied. This melancholy event diminished the prestige of the ruling families and made evident the necessity of radical reforms. But when it came to the inauguration of real reforms, and more particularly to the limitation of the power of the Council of Ten, the influence of the great families was ultimately strong enough to frustrate any attempts at a change for the better. Discontent and a spirit of rebellion were the unavoidable consequences. Much sadder was the fate of Savoy, torn by internal and by foreign war. Under Charles Emmanuel I, this duchy had played an important part, and just for this reason both France and Spain were eager to make themselves masters of the land that commanded the Alpine passes between France and Italy. With this aim they availed themselves of the strife over the regency, which broke out in 1637 on the death of Charles Emmanuel's son and successor, Victor Amadeus I, who had left only a minor son. According to the Duke's will, the regency was to be conducted by his widow, Christine, sister of Louis XIII, but as she, a foreigner and a Frenchwoman, was unpopular, her brother-in-law, Cardinal Maurice, and Prince Thomas sought to exclude her from the government. If the Princess held the office, Richelieu would be master of Savoy and Piedmont. If, however, the two princes, both of whom were in Spanish pay, obtained it, Olivares would gain these provinces for his country. Prince Thomas, with Spanish help, took possession of the capital, Turin, the Cardinal occupied the country of Nice, while Christine, along with the young Duke, Charles Emmanuel II, held court in Chambéry. Christine then went to Grenoble to meet Louis and Richelieu and entreat them for help. They sent Count Harcourt to Piedmont. Meanwhile Leganes, the Spanish governor of Milan, entered the unfortunate land and wasted and plundered it. 1638. Harcourt defeated his enemy at Casale, and undertook the siege of Turin, whose inhabitants bitterly hated the French and defended themselves gallantly. At length Leganes came to their aid, but all his attempts to storm Harcourt's camp failed. Famine finally compelled the surrender of the city, after a memorable defence of 16 months, September 1640. Christine returned to Turin, where the French at once inaugurated a reign of terror for all their adversaries. Meanwhile the war continued for several years, and with great injury to the country. The two princes saw this with sorrow, and were forced to recognise that Savoy was treated only as a tool by the rival contestants, whose sole aim was their own interests. In 1642, therefore, they submitted to their sister-in-law, who granted them their positions as governors, as well as a certain degree of co-operation in public affairs. The Spaniards were driven from one after another of the fortresses which they held in Piedmont. The land was left in the most wretched condition, and, what its people felt most keenly of all, in complete dependence on France. Thus did Italy become more and more the battlefield and the spoil of the Habsburgs and Bourbons. The political and military decadence of Italy in the first half of the 17th century was reflected in its literature. The authors of this period are far from possessing the power and dignity of their predecessors. Their type was a Neapolitan, Giovanni Battista Marini, 1569–1622. Only a few years before his death he published his great work, Adonis, a needlessly long amatory poem of 45,000 verses. As the subject matter is effeminate, so the treatment is characterized by a mawkish sweetness and a straining after effect by means of florid hyperbole and overstrained imagery, that, in spite of the beauty of isolated passages, make it intolerable to the modern reader. Marinism had been charged with being the cause of similar sins in non-Italian authors, but without foundation. The degeneracy and departure from nature, characteristic of the 17th century everywhere, produced the same results in foreign lands as in Italy. Among his compatriots, Marini's poetry met with enthusiastic acceptance, as evidence of how exactly it was in harmony with the tastes of the time. The old heroic poems, the poetical romances of chivalry, on the other hand, had lost favour with the public. This perversion of taste Alessandro Tassoni lashes with pungent satire in his Rape of the Bucket, a comic epic of inexhaustible and unoffensive wit. He gives us a caricature of the wars that the Italian states so often carried on with one another, furnishing, as it were, a prototype of the War of Castro. Gabriel Cabrera of Savona, 1552–1637, belongs, both in point of time and in the bent of his genius, to the 16th century. A profound scholar and an ardent admirer of the antique, he knew how to transform the old in accordance with modern Italian ideas. He shows to best advantage in his lyrics, in which he frees himself from the hitherto exclusively dominant Petrarchian type, and is, in a truly original manner, both novel and sublime. In boldness of imaginative power, in lofty flights of genius, in freedom and diversity of form, he has had no equal in his native land until the 19th century. But he had no imitators in his own age. The fashion favoured Marini. The style of elegant prose literature was equally affected by the depraved taste of the times. It would indeed be difficult to name here a single original book of permanent value. Letters, however, on the most varied political, social, and intellectual questions, were then much in favour, and the collections of those of Cardinal Bentivoglio, a distinguished statesman and historian, and of the renowned Galileo, are worthy of mention. Boccalini's satire Miscellanies from Parnassus is a racy booklet that in its day enjoyed great popularity. Highly characteristic of the humane but effeminate Italian of his epoch is his outburst against the military spirit and the usages of war. War, he says, is sometimes necessary, but it is yet a condition so inhuman and barbarous that there are no fine words that can make it tolerable. Boccalini was an enthusiastic republican, and therefore lauds Venice, while he scourges with bitter irony the petty princely tyrants of his time. In his Touchstone he develops his political sentiments still more trenchantly, and in doing so sheds a clear light on contemporaneous public opinion in Italy. He gives undisguised and wrathful expression to the hatred of all Italians for Spanish domination, for the court of the Catholic king, and for his subjects' arrogant lust for conquest and ascendancy. The Italy of our epoch boasts of two admirable historical works, Bentivoglio's History of the War in the Netherlands, and Davila's Civil War in France. Both writers show the same sobriety of judgment and appropriate style and method that distinguished the great Italian historians of the 16th century. Both were intimately acquainted with the lands of which they wrote. Bentivoglio had resided, as papal nuncio, in Brussels and Paris. Davila had held important military and political posts in France and Venice. Passing from practical to theoretical politicians, we come to the name of Thomas Campanella. This philosophical Dominican monk, persecuted both by the Spanish government and the Inquisition, wrote a treatise on the State, which, along with much eulogy of the Papal and French courts, contains many sound observations. His City of the Sun is a fantastic sort of political and social utopia, based in many parts on the Platonic model, but permeated with his own chimerical and mystical philosophy. Hunted incessantly by his numerous foes, this gifted monk died in 1639 in the retirement of the monastery. Much more practical than Campanella was Antonio Serra, whose work on the causes of wealth in gold and silver is a work of political economy of high value for the history of this science. It comprises a complete exposition of the so-called mercantile system, which later, through Colbert's example, prevailed throughout Europe for more than a century. This system lays the main stress on manufactures and commerce, which it holds to be much more susceptible of development than agriculture, and which therefore ought to be fostered at the expense of the latter. Serra's book, 1613, had great influence on the economical and financial opinions of the day. His ideal was the state of Venice, wealthy because it was an exclusively commercial city, as contrasted with poor agricultural Naples. In the exact sciences, Italy contended for the foremost place with Germany, which could boast of her Copernicus and Kepler. Cavalieri, professor of mathematics in Bologna, carried the mathematical ideas suggested by the latter great scholar still farther, and through his work on the Geometry of the Indivisibles, 1635, became the father of modern geometry. By this method he attained much more precise determinations and measurements than had been possible before. Aldrovandi summed up the whole zoological knowledge of his time in comprehensive handbooks. Caspar Aselli, professor of anatomy in Pavia, discovered the lacteals of the mesentery that convey the chyle to the blood, and thus play an important part in the alimentation of the animal body. But the most eminent, most gifted, and most renowned figure in Italian science was Galileo Galilei. Born at Pisa in 1564, the son of an able mathematician, he studied medicine in his native city, but soon turned to mathematical and physical studies, seeking for these a firm and reliable foundation in mathematics. A remarkable faculty of observation, an acute judgment, and an intellect at once profound and clear united to qualify him for making his amazing discoveries. The oscillations of a lamp suspended from the dome of the cathedral at Pisa led to the discovery of the equal duration of the oscillations of a pendulum, and with this he associated the most interesting investigations concerning the centre of gravity of bodies. One of the first fruits of his labours was the invention of the hydrostatic balance, by which he determined the specific gravity of bodies. His most important discoveries were made after he had exchanged the mathematical chair of Pisa for that of Padua. Here his contributions to science were the thermometer, a proportional compass or sector, and the refracting telescope for astronomical investigations (1609). Imperfect as was Galileo's telescope, chiefly from the limited extent of its field, the great man was yet able to make the most astonishing observations with it. He recognised the inequalities on the moon's surface, and rightly attributed these to mountains. He even made approximate calculations of their height. Further, he resolved the Milky Way and certain other nebulae into multitudes of suns, massed in special points of the firmament. He detected 4 little stars in the neighbourhood of Jupiter, and rightly determined them to be satellites of the great planet. These surprising discoveries he announced in a book which justly bore the title of Nuncius Siderus, the Starry Messenger. Men at this time took the liveliest interest in astronomy, partly because the theories and writings of Copernicus and Kepler had aroused their curiosity, but probably more because the science was so intimately associated with astrology. The Nuncius Siderus attracted universal attention, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany, by rewarding its author with the richly endowed sinecure of court mathematician, made it possible for Galileo to devote himself in Florence exclusively to his studies. His astronomical discoveries now followed in rapid succession, one of the principal being the earth-like character of the planets, as opposed to the solar nature of the fixed stars. Galileo's telescopic observations had fully convinced him of the absolute correctness of the Copernican theory of the universe. His advocacy of this brought the wrath of the Church upon his head, for it had denounced the Copernican system as heretical. Galileo offered to prove that this system was in perfect harmony with orthodoxy, but this attempt to compel the Church to submission in her own domain only served to embitter her more. Through personal exertions in Rome, Galileo had no difficulty in securing his own safety, but he could not prevent the Index officers from stigmatizing Copernicus's doctrine as "absurd and infidel," and placing his book, with several of Galileo's own treatises relative thereto, in the Index Prohibitorum. The philosopher submitted to the ecclesiastical dictum, but in his heart he rebelled against the judgment. When, 7 years later, his friend and patron, Cardinal Barberini, ascended the papal throne as Urban VIII, he again ventured in a "Dialogue of the two chief systems of the universe, on a comprehensive demonstration of the truth of the Copernican views." Scarcely was the work published, 1632, when the Jesuits persuaded the Pope that the astronomer had held him up to ridicule. Galileo had to appear before the Inquisition in 1633. In spite of the contemporaneous and subsequent falsifications in the records of the process, it is now proved that Galileo was really subjected to torture in accordance with the terms of sentence pronounced on him. The permission to print, formerly granted to him, was declared to have been obtained under false pretences, and the philosopher, then in his 70th year, was compelled on bended knee to abjure the Copernican doctrine. His dialogue was suppressed, and he himself was condemned to imprisonment for an indefinite time. His sentence was indeed commuted to enforced retirement at his own villa at Florence, and he never again regained full liberty. A victim to manifold bodily sufferings, he survived his trial 8 years, and died in 1642. He had become blind, yet had occupied himself unremittingly with scientific work, and with the compilation and arrangement of the results of his earlier investigations. In Italy these could not be published, but this was accomplished abroad, especially in Germany. Like Italian poetry, architecture fell into decay. True beauty, nobility of form, and symmetry of proportions were sacrificed to violent and tasteless effects. The aim now was massiveness in proportions, extravagant richness of ornamentation, and pictorial perspective not at all in harmony with the essential nature of this art. Nothing kept its natural character, the straight lines of the walls were converted into advancing and retiring curves with bulky projections. Architraves were sinuous, the gables of open work without purpose, the pillars unreasonably serpentine. Everywhere there was an ostentatious profusion of interlaced foliage, fruit pieces, figures, shells, and emblems of all kinds. Lorenzo Bernini (1598 1680) is the most prominent representative of this Baroque style. His disciple and rival, Francesco Borromini, sought to surpass him through the exaggeration of tasteless ornamentation and a preposterous medley of all the constructive elements. His example was unfortunately too much followed north of the Alps. In the art of sculpture also Bernini was the despot of his age, and here too all canons of art and good taste were outraged. Extravagant emotions, sensual treatment of the nude, coarse strength in the male figures, coquettish attitudes in those of the females, were too much in keeping with the effeminate life of the Italy of his period. A host of subordinate masters imitated his vicious example. Neither could Italian painting remain entirely unaffected by the prevailing tendency. But here this was by no means so incongruous as in the case of sculpture. There were at this period highly gifted artists who knew how to elevate it from its eccentricities, and how to purify and ennoble it. In the beginning of our epoch, the Carracci sought to bring painting back to the study of nature and of the great artists of the 16th century, and they attained the happiest results. But their disciples, Domenico Zampieri, commonly called Domenichino, and Guido Reni, were able to follow this tendency only in their earlier pictures, and soon began to prefer showy ornamentation and a somewhat excessive sweetness of expression. Carlo Dolci is the characteristic representative of this school. Yet these artists, among whom Francesco Barbieri, called Guercino, takes a high prize, knew how to lend a high and enduring value to their works, and to elevate them above the commonplace of mere sensuous effects, by the marvellous blending and power of their colours, by their sense for the beautiful, and by their truth of feeling. In politics, Italy and Spain retired more and more into the background to make room for the predominating influence of France. A great revolution too was preparing in the east of Europe, which was to elevate Russia at the expense of Poland and Turkey. On the destiny of Poland, the 25 years' reign of the fanatical disciple of Jesuitism, Sigismund III, exercised the most baneful influence. In this time all the germs of corruption were developed which the predominance of a selfish petty nobility and the brutal violence of the counter-reformation had introduced into the State. For a time, indeed, the valour of her nobles and her abundant population maintained the prestige of Poland abroad. Her intervention in Russian affairs gained for her, at the Peace of Devulino (1618), Smolensk, Severa, and Chernigov, important provinces which introduced her sway into the very heart of Russia. But this success was much more than counterbalanced by the rise of a powerful and popular dynasty in Russia, endowed with all the freshness and vigour of youth. The decline of the welfare of the Polish people became more and more rapid. Wild revolts of the refractory nobles shook the fabric of the State. The great rebellion of the Voivode Nicolas Żebrzydowski, notwithstanding occasional successes of the royal troops, was brought to an end only by inglorious concessions on the part of the Crown. A war with Turkey, provoked by a contest over the election of a prince in Moldavia, ended with the Peace of Chotin in 1621, which conceded to the Turks this fortress, commanding the most important passage of the Dniester, as well as the sole right of nominating the Moldavian princes. Scarcely was this war closed, when Sigismund involved himself in the great German religious war by taking the side of Catholicism and Austria. This act he expiated by the cession to Gustavus Adolphus of a part of Prussia and of Livonia. After Sigismund's death, although no rival appeared to contest the crown with his son Władysław, it pleased the nobility to institute an interregnum for 6 months, during which the turbulent elements were free to indulge, unchecked, in violence, plundering, and personal feuds. Finally Władysław IV was elected, a man by no means wanting in courage and military ability. When the Russian Czar, Michael Romanov, attempted to take advantage of the change in Polish rulers To recover the provinces which he had lost by the peace of Devulino, Władysław completely hemmed in his army and forced it to capitulate. A peace concluded at Vyázma confirmed Poland in her possession. Furthermore, the peace of Stumsdorf with Sweden, 1635, gave back to the king, if not Livonia, at least that portion of Prussia lost by his father. But the process of internal decay had made rapid strides from two causes, the predominance of the clergy and the growing usurpations of the nobility. Władysław was an obedient disciple of the Church. The Jesuits had already the higher education in their hands, the king made over to them the middle and lower schools as well. Henceforth, in Poland, teaching had to be in strictest accordance with the dicta of the Church. The nobles, on their part, broke down the military strength of the kingdom, through a law that the standing army should consist only of a guard of 1,200 men, the object being to make the ruler wholly subservient to them. The punishment for this selfish and unwise procedure of the nobles was not long in coming. We have already spoken of the constitution of the Cossack state proper, on the middle and lower Dnieper, which, developed by Russian and Lithuanian fugitives, had received from King Stephen Bathory a firm organization under Polish suzerainty, yet resting on entirely independent military institutions. It soon acquired considerable power, and its undaunted warriors, not content with combating the Turks and Crim Tartars by land, took with equal skill and courage to the sea, and in their light boats plundered without cessation the shores of Asia Minor and the Balkan Peninsula, spreading terror into the very harbour of Constantinople. The Porte had often complained at Warsaw. This gave the Poles a pretext for attempting to exterminate not only the political freedom, but also the Greek religion of the Cossacks. First, these were compelled to renounce the election of their hetman, and to submit to the leadership of the Polish commander-in-chief. Then the Jesuits came into the land and shut up their churches, permitting only the worship of the so-called Greek Unionists, who acknowledged the authority of Rome. Ultimately Polish nobles settled in the Ukraine and transformed the hitherto free Cossacks into serfs. As these repeatedly rose in revolt, the Poles, in their Diet of 1638, took advantage of their rebellion to take from them all personal and political rights. The Cossacks found a leader in Bogdan Khmelnitzky, whom a Polish noble had deprived of his land. As Khmelnitzky could obtain no justice in Warsaw, he raised the banner of revolt in 1648. Forthwith the whole Ukraine was under arms. The people of Little Russia, embittered by the Jesuits' zeal for conversion, streamed into the camp of the new hetman. Even their former foes, the Tartars, greedy for Polish spoil, sent help. In the midst of these disorders, King Władysław IV died in 1648. The nobles wrangled for 5 weeks over the election of a king, to Zamość with destruction in his train. At length the exertions and the gold of the queen widow secured the election of John Casimir, brother of the deceased. The last of the house of Vasa, he had been, up to this time, a Jesuit and a cardinal. But the Pope freely released him from the priestly order. He proved, however, by no means equal to the situation. He first sought to win over Khmelnitzky, but the Polish nobles would hear nothing of dealings with the despised "peasants," and under the leadership of Jeremiah Wiśniowiecki, fell suddenly on the unsuspecting Cossacks, massacring them mercilessly. This scandalous outrage fired the Cossacks with the wildest passion for revenge. Bogdan, in alliance with the Tartar Khan, Islam Gerai, vanquished the king and his array of nobles in various battles on the plain of Zborov, and so hemmed him in that he was forced to come to terms with the Cossacks. He had to grant to them their former practical independence, and to pay a yearly tribute to the Tartars. The Greco-Catholic metropolis of Kiev received a seat and a vote in the Polish Senate. From these experiences the Polish aristocracy might have drawn the conclusion that the welfare of their fatherland demanded a more centralized government. But in the Diet of 1652 the infamous Liberum Veto was declared a perpetual law. There had never really been any systematic voting in the Diet. The majority had been in the habit of simply shouting down the minority, or if the latter did not acquiesce gracefully, of compelling them to submission by violence, and occasionally by murder. On one occasion, when the most important measures in regard to the defence of the kingdom against the Cossacks and Tartars were under consideration, one insignificant Lithuanian country member shouted into the hall, "I dissent," and forthwith fled, that he might not be compelled to change his vote. His friends and party maintained that, except by unanimous consent, the Diet could arrive at no valid decision, and this view, absurd as it is, they were able to enforce. The Diet separated without result. Thenceforth any member had the power to nullify the proceedings of the Diet by the use of the liberum veto. Never has the passion for personal liberty carried a ruling class to so pernicious an extreme. To the caprice of the individual were sacrificed the peace, the greatness, nay, the very existence of the fatherland. While the nobles in this way doomed the kingdom to weakness and internal dissolution, they revoked the compact entered into with the Cossacks. Above all, the Jesuit party in the Senate would hear nothing of the admission of the schismatic metropolis, Kiev, into the Diet. Provoked by the constant insults and encroachments of the Poles, Bogdan Khmelnitzky once more took up arms. The Cossacks soon found a mightier ally than the Tartars. In 1654 they finally renounced Polish rule and placed themselves under the protection of their co-religionists, the Russians. The Czar, Alexis Mikhailovich, gladly agreed to all their conditions. They were to be ruled by their own elected chiefs in accordance with their own laws, and were to pay no tribute. 60,000 of them were to be enrolled for war service, and receive regular pay from the Czar. Henceforth this martial people, instead of being a bulwark of Poland against Russia, became the frontier guard of Russia against Poland. With overpowering strength, in which religious zeal played no small part, the Russians and Cossacks repelled the attacks of the Poles, conquered White Russia and Lithuania, and even took the fortress of Lublin in Poland proper. With the political decline of Poland was associated her intellectual decadence. The preceding epoch of the Reformation is regarded as the golden age of Polish literature. Nicolas Rey (1507 1568) celebrated sometimes the views of the reformers, sometimes the joys of love, and gave his robust humour expression in strongly spiced satires. Of much higher and finer endowments than this gifted country gentleman was John Kochanowski (1530 1584), the foremost of Poland's older poets. In him profound knowledge of classical antiquity was associated with deep political feeling and the happiest mastery of expression. As a lyric poet he was never equalled in Poland. Side by side with these noble authors stand the low-born Sebastian Klonowicz. His revolutionary temper found voice in powerful and racy but bitter verses. Prose was written almost exclusively in Latin. All the more credit therefore belongs to Lucas Górnicki's Courtier, which was written in Polish, and is an admirable mirror of the usages of the higher society of his time. The exciting political and religious life of the period exerted a stimulating influence on Polish oratory, of which some masterpieces remain. Under the direful rule of Sigismund III, the lustre of Polish literature began to grow dim. The burghers were shut out not only from all participation in public life, but also from the higher education. Even the nobles ceased to resort to foreign universities, so perilous, as they believed, for their faith. The University of Cracow rapidly retrograded. The authority of a tutelary and exclusive church interdicted all free investigation and independent thought. The political disorganization and the self-seeking of the ruling caste enfeebled every higher national aspiration. Soon Latin became the dominant literary language. Little except translations from the French appeared in the native tongue. After long continued disorder, Russia had received a firm organization through the installation of the new dynasty of the House of Romanov. The Czar, Michael Fedorovich, was a well-meaning but weak prince, who all his life was subservient to foreign influences. The boyars availed themselves of this weakness to exert a considerable influence on the government, but the situation was changed when, after the peace of Devulino, the Czar's father, the monk Philaretus returned from a Polish prison and was nominated by his son to the Patriarchate of Moscow. This energetic man became joint ruler, and caused the year of his rule as spiritual primate to appear on the public documents side by side with that of the temporal potentate, a custom continued by his successors in the patriarchal chair of Moscow. The boyars were once more deprived of all influence and reduced to their former state of vassalage. The Council of State was still called together on occasion of high importance, and certain of its members were bold enough to express their views on the questions submitted, but the decision of the Czar was final. Michael and his successor, Alexis, assembled on several occasions a general council consisting of 2 nobles and 2 burghers from each city, but even here the members were only asked to express their opinions, without the Czar being in any way bound by them. This was hardly a representative parliament, as some Slavophiles would have us believe. On the death of Czar Michael, his son Alexis, a lad of 16, ascended the throne. At first the youthful prince was completely dependent on his tutor, the boyar, Boris Morozov, who, misusing his power, espoused his pupil to the daughter of a petty noble, whose sister he himself had married, and heaped offices and pensions upon his own and the Czarina's relatives. Plundering of the people and scandalous misgovernment through Boris's protégés was now the rule in Russia. Commercial monopolies in the hands of the dominant families hampered traffic and increased the cost of the necessaries of life. At length the long-suffering populace of Moscow rose in wild revolt (1648), not against the Czar, but against his officials, and struck down a number of them. Alexis rescued Moscow with difficulty, and had to banish him from his presence and exclude him from all public offices. Alexis thereupon appointed a commission of nobles and ecclesiastics to compile a new code of laws (July 1648), based on the rights of the Church, former edicts of the Czar, and decisions of the boyars. A national convention in October 1648 recognized the new code, which was then promulgated in all lands under the sceptre of the Czar. Yet notwithstanding this wise and popular measure, the land did not attain peace. Official dishonesty provoked new risings in Novgorod and Pskov in 1650, some of which had to be suppressed by armed force. To cut off the source of such outbreaks, the Czar constituted a new board, which, under various names, had continued to the present day, being now known as the Chamber of Secret Affairs. To it was entrusted the unconditional execution of the Czar's decrees. Only insignificant persons were called to it, for they would be blind tools of the sovereign authority, and thus pave the way for unconditional and unlimited absolutism. This strengthening of the power of the Czar was of all the more importance because Russia was soon involved in a long and decisive conflict with Poland. The Cossack War sounded the signal. Among the results were the lasting subjugation of Poland and the ultimate elevation of Russia to be the foremost Eastern power. This change was made possible by the decadence of the Ottoman Empire, which showed itself in all departments of government, and first of that in finance. In the time of Sultan Soliman the Great, 1,000,000 ducats, about $9,677,400, could be deposited a year in the treasury as surplus. Under his successor conditions were reversed. The expenditure soon exceeded the income by as much as 1/4. Thefts and embezzlements in all branches co-operated with the cupidity of the sultans, who needed large sums for their pleasures, to empty the treasury. Peculation was organized into the system. The highest offices, even the governorships of whole provinces, the princely dignity in Moldavia and in Wallachia, were sold at auction to the highest bidders. No wonder that the purchasers sought to make up for this outlay by exactions from the miserable subjects, who, with no one beneath them to be preyed upon, had to bear the whole intolerable burden. The oppressive burden of the taxes, the ignorance and indifference of the ephemeral officials, produced widespread poverty, misery, and depopulation. The husbandman cultivated only as many acres as would meet his barest needs, for he knew that any surplus would be taken from him by violence. In all quarters were to be seen deserted homesteads and houses falling to ruin. The enormous extent of the Ottoman Empire, the length of whose frontier was estimated at about 15,000 miles, was an element of weakness rather than strength. In Asia the empire comprehended Anatolia, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Syria, Palestine, Arabia. In Africa, Egypt, Tripoli, Tunis, Algiers. In Europe, Thrace, Bulgaria, Moldavia, Wallachia, Transylvania, the greater part of Hungary, Bosnia, Serbia, Dalmatia, Albania, Macedonia, and Greece with the archipelago. The fairest and most fertile districts of 3 continents, from the Tigris to the middle Danube and almost to the Pillars of Hercules, were subject to the Sultans, who instead of using their unbounded resources to make themselves masters of the world, merely spread death and ruin over once blooming and vigorous empires. In the families of the Sultans constant strifes and bloody conflicts arose among the wives, or among their sons, or between the sons and their father. Even under the great Soliman such conflicts had taken place. The Grand Viziers began to have weightier influence in state affairs than the Sultans themselves, who succumbed more and more to the intrigues of the harem. The personal council of the Vizier constituted the Sublime Porte, the highest political authority. The most illustrious of the Viziers were Mohammad Sokolli, who through the Christian origin rose under Soliman to this foremost position, and under Selim II became all powerful. It was due to him that Turkey, under the weak Selim, continued on the whole to maintain its position. Sokolli's ability, uprightness, and toleration for his former fellow believers, the Christians, were commended by all his well-informed contemporaries. After ruling for 14 years, he fell in 1579 by the dagger of a dervish to whom he did not appear sufficiently fanatical. Under the Grand Vizier, and in conjunction with him, ruled the Divan, a body composed of the highest officials of the empire, and meeting regularly 4 times a week for the consideration of matters of policy, administration, and justice. To it everyone could submit his case. Its decisions required confirmation by the Sultan, but this was seldom withheld. The military power of Turkey rested on its feudal cavalry, every warrior being hereditary possessor of a fief, larger or smaller. The number of these sipahi (spahis) amounted to at least 200,000, organized by districts, sanjaks, under sanjak beys. These again were organized into provinces, eyalets, under beyler beys, or governors, the military leaders being also the civil administrators of their respective districts. The Spahis laid the foundation of Turkey's greatness, but with increasing riches and effeminacy they lost their warlike spirit. Recourse was now had to paid Spahis, at first merely a sort of bodyguard, but latterly increased in number to 40,000 heavy armed horsemen. To these must be added the irregular cavalry, who instead of receiving pay, remunerated themselves by pillaging, and the Tartar, Moldavo-Wallachian, Georgian, and other auxiliaries. The total number of these horsemen was, in the 17th century, more than 220,000, and before firearms were perfected, they were the main support of Turkey's military supremacy. Meanwhile a reliable infantry was needed. This was by preference composed of Christian boys who had been carried off from their parents, and who, after being trained in Islamism and subjected to discipline, were drafted into the corps of Janissaries. In 1638, under Murad IV, this compulsory enlistment was abolished, and even after, the corps consisted exclusively of volunteers. The service was severe and for life, but the position was held in honour and was well paid. Originally the corps had been distinguished for its brotherly spirit, order, morality, and devoted heroism, but deterioration came with the admission of young Turks, to whom the privilege of marriage could not be denied, as it had been to the stolen offspring of Christians. Thus the military power of Turkey degenerated rapidly. The more disorganized the state of the exchequer, and the more irregularly the soldiers were paid, the more frequent were the revolts that sometimes led to bloody catastrophes. After the battle of Lepanto, matters went even worse with the Turkish navy. The fleets lost confidence, and no longer ventured out of the harbours. The Turks, brave and enterprising by land, had ever felt themselves awkward and timid at sea. The poverty of the government also wrought evil. In the first half of the 17th century the Turkish navy was reduced to 50 ships, which were fit only for the pettiest services. It must be admitted that the Osmanlis did not understand how to take advantage of their triumphs on European soil, so as to evolve an enduring national organization. Rigid and severe in its forms, the government was always alien and hostile to its subject races. Culture remained the property of the few. Individual sultans favoured learning, but irrespective of some historical works, this was altogether of a religious character. There is a striking contrast between the literary barrenness of Turkey and the brilliant intellectual development that once distinguished their Arabian and Persian fellow believers. In the domain of politics the condition of affairs was similar. Legislation was stationary, for it could not deviate an iota from the principles laid down in the Koran. The Christian subjects of the Turks were treated as mere cattle. No effects were made to convert them, although this would have greatly strengthened Turkey in the Balkan Peninsula and along the Danube. Nay, from pure selfishness some sultans forbade conversions in large numbers to Islam. This would have involved the loss of the poll tax imposed on Christians and the conscription of their children. Revolts among the Christians were frequent, and were crushed only by the most brutal violence. The most striking proof of the Turks' incapacity for rule is the fact that they could dispense with the despised unbelievers neither in the administration nor in the army. Their hosts were mainly recruited from captive Christian children, and the higher administrative offices were almost exclusively occupied by Christians. Only by virtue of this peculiar system was Turkey able to maintain her integrity till towards the end of the 17th century. On the death of the debauchee Selim II in 1574, Mohamed Sokolli was successful in placing Selim's eldest son, Murad III, on the throne. He inaugurated his reign, in accordance with the ghastly Ottoman custom, by slaying his younger brothers. He soon plunged into the enervating excesses of the harem, and showed zeal for nothing save the scandalous plunderings of his subjects. By this plundering he obtained the means for the constant largesses by which the fidelity of his troops was secured. Yet in spite of the deplorable conduct of the administration, his adventurous provincial governors were able to extend his domains in Hungary at the cost of Austria. Meanwhile another war broke out, and this time with the oriental rival of the Ottoman Empire, Persia, 1578. This state was hostile to Turkey, not only on political grounds but also on religious ones. The Persian sect of Shiites and the Turkish sect of Sunnites hated each other. After a war of 12 years, peace was concluded in 1590, on terms highly honourable for the Osmanlis. Persia ceded to them the whole of Georgia, as well as the provinces on the southwest coast of the Caspian. Yet, notwithstanding this brilliant result, the Persian campaigns were disastrous for the Turks. Their best armies, to the number, it is said, of 600,000 men, were destroyed, and their finances reduced to a state of hopeless disorder. The ill effects appeared prominently when the war against Emperor Rudolph II broke out anew in 1593. In this campaign the Turks suffered numerous defeats, and had it not been for the Emperor's frenzied passion for persecution and the risings of the Hungarians and Transylvanians under Bocskai, the Porte would have suffered heavy losses in the peace of Żitwa Torok in 1607. Meantime Murad III had been replaced by his son Mohamed III, and he by his brother Ahmed I, but these insignificant princes exerted no material influence upon the course of political and military events. Ahmed soon found a formidable foe in the energetic and gifted Shah of Persia, Abbas the Great. This prince undertook to wrest from the Turks their conquests in the last war, and the real weakness of the Ottoman Empire was revealed. In the campaign from 1604 to 1619 all that the Turks had acquired since 1590 was lost. The Persian wars had exhausted the best strength of the state. The extent to which the decadence of the Turkish government had gone is shown by the fact that, on the death of Ahmed in 1617, the Divan, that it might order matters at its own discretion, elevated his imbecile brother Mustafa to the throne. In 3 months he was deposed in favour of Osman II, the eldest son of Ahmed I. The new Sultan was a high-spirited, chivalric youth, inspired above all with the ambition to restore the Empire and his race to their ancient glory. But his warlike projects were not favoured by the indolent Spahis and Janissaries. The failure of a campaign against Poland heightened the discontent. The Grand Vizier, the Minister of War, and other high functionaries and officers were massacred by the maddened soldiery. Finally Osman himself shared their fate, the first case of regicide in Turkish history. The imbecile Mustafa was replaced on the throne, where he conducted himself in the most insane manner. At length the Divan and the army alike recognized that an end must be put to such a deplorable condition of affairs. In 1623 Mustafa was relegated to the harem, where he lived in obscurity for 16 years, and Osman's brother, Murat IV, was set in his place. Murat, though like his murdered brother a youth of energy and enterprise, gave way without restraint to his sensual passions, and thus ultimately wrecked himself. He humbled the insolent arrogance of the Janissaries by terrible and repeated executions. External affairs soon demanded his active intervention. Several Asiatic pashas rose in revolt, and Shah Abbas the Great of Persia was ready to take advantage of these turmoils to extend his own dominions. In 1623 he made himself master of Baghdad, the capital of Mesopotamia and the ancient residence of the Caliphs, and forthwith proceeded to further conquests. In 1628, luckily for the Osmanlis, he died, and his son, Sephi, was of far inferior capacity. Sultan Murat now undertook war in person against Persia, and conducted it with the fierce energy characteristic of his nature. He retook Erivan, Tabriz, and Van, and finally, in 1638, stormed Baghdad, which was now little more than a heap of ruins. In the next year the long protracted Persian war was brought to a close by a peace that left affairs very much as they were before it broke out. Murat now thought of turning his victorious arms against Christian Europe, which was rent by numberless conflicts. Christendom trembled at the threatening danger, when in 1640 the Sultan died, worn out prematurely by his debaucheries and passions. He had restored discipline and confidence to his army, and order to his finances, but these reforms were based merely on fear, and everything depended on the character of those who should hereafter hold the reins of government. Ibrahim, Murat's youngest brother, who succeeded to the throne, was an enervated weakling. He had, however, able ministers who maintained the prestige of Turkey abroad, reorganized the fleet, and began in 1645 a war with Venice for the possession of Crete. In 1648 Ibrahim was murdered by the Janissaries, who thereupon placed his youthful son, Mohammed IV, upon the throne. The real masters of the empire were now the Janissaries, like the Praetorian Guards in ancient Rome, and before their power both the sovereign and his ministers trembled. The destruction of the State seemed imminent, but it was averted by a race of hereditary Grand Viziers, who, beginning with Mohamed Kuprili in 1656, and holding office for a quarter of a century, secured for the Ottoman Empire a new lease of life. The alliance with France under Louis XIV, effected at this time, lends a fictitious importance to the position of Turkey in European affairs in the middle of the 17th century. End of Europe in the Middle Ages in the 17th Century, Part II, by Martin Philipson.
The History of British India by James Mill, 1773 to 1836, published in 1817. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of British India. Chapter 1. From the commencement of the efforts to begin a trade with India till the change of the company from a regulated to a joint stock company. The Portuguese had formed important establishments in India before the British offered themselves as competitors for the riches of the East. From the time when Vasco da Gama distinguished his nation by discovering the passage round the Cape of Good Hope, and first reached the coast of Hindustan, a whole century had elapsed, during which without a rival they had enjoyed and abused the advantages of superior knowledge and art amid a feeble and half-civilized race. They had explored the Indian Ocean as far as Japan, had discovered its islands, rich with some of the most favorite productions of nature, had achieved the most brilliant conquests, and by their commerce poured into Europe in unexampled profusion those commodities of the East on which the nations at that time set an extraordinary value. The circumstances of this splendid fortune had violently attracted the attention of Europe. The commerce of India, even when confined to those narrow limits which a carriage by land had prescribed, was supposed to have elevated feeble states into great ones, and to have constituted an enviable part in the fortune even of the most opulent and powerful, to have contributed largely to support the Grecian monarchies both in Syria and Egypt, to have retarded the downfall of Constantinople, and to have raised the small and obscure Republic of Venice to the rank and influence of the most potent kingdoms. The discovery, therefore, of a new channel for this opulent traffic, and the happy experience of the Portuguese, inflamed the cupidity of all the maritime nations of Europe, and set before them the most tempting prospects. An active spirit of commerce had already begun to display itself in England. The nation had happily obtained a full share of the improvement which had dawned in Europe, and the tranquil and economic reign of Elizabeth had been favorable both to the accumulation of capital and to those projects of private emoluments on which the spirit of commerce depends. A brisk trade and of considerable extent had been carried on during the greater part of the 16th century with the Netherlands, at that time the most improved and commercial part of Europe. The merchants of Bristol had opened a traffic with the Canary Islands, those of Plymouth with the coasts of Guinea and Brazil. The English now fished on the banks of Newfoundland, and explored the Sea of Spitzbergen for the sovereign of the waters. They engrossed, by an exclusive privilege, the commerce of Russia. They took an active part in the trade of the Mediterranean. The company of merchant adventurers pushed so vigorously the traffic with Germany and the central parts of Europe, as highly to excite the jealousy of the Hanse towns, and the Protestant inhabitants of the Netherlands and France, flying from the persecutions of their own oppressive and bigoted governments, augmented the commercial resources of England by the capital and skill of a large importation of the most ingenious and industrious people in Europe. In these circumstances, the lustre of the Portuguese transactions in the East peculiarly attracted the admiration of the English. Already a most adventurous spirit of navigation was roused in the nation. The English were the first who had imitated the example of the Spaniards in visiting the New World. In 1497, Cabot with a small squadron explored the coast of America from Labrador to Virginia, and discovered the islands of Newfoundland and St. John. An English merchant named Robert Thorn, who had been stationed for many years at Seville in Spain, and had acquired particular knowledge of the intercourse which the Portuguese had opened with the East, presented a project to Henry VIII. About the year 1527, the accomplishment of which he imagined would place his country in a situation no less enviable than that of the Portuguese. as that nation had obtained a passage to India by a course to the southeast, and pretended a right, which they defended by force, to its exclusive occupation, he supposed that his countrymen might reach the same part of the globe by sailing to the northwest, and thus obtain a passage at once expeditious and undisputed. What effect this representation produced on the mind of Henry is not accurately known. But 2 voyages in the course of his reign were undertaken for the discovery of a northwest passage, one about this period and another 10 years later. Nothing can more clearly prove to us the ardor with which the English coveted a share in the riches supposed to be drawn by the Portuguese from the east, than the persevering efforts which they made to discover a channel from which the Portuguese would have no pretence to exclude them. 2 attempts in the reign of Henry to obtain a passage by the northwest had failed. Their exploring fancy anticipated a happier issue from a voyage to the northeast. A small squadron, accordingly, under the direction of Sir Hugh Willoughby, was fitted out in the reign of Edward VI, and sailing along the coast of Norway, doubled the North Cape, where it was encountered by a storm. The ship of Sir Hugh was driven to an obscure spot in Russia Lapland, where he and his crew perished miserably by the climate. The other principal vessel found shelter in the harbor of Archangel, and was the first foreign ship by which it was entered. So well did Chancellor, the captain of the vessel, improve this incident, that he opened a commercial intercourse with the natives, visited the monarch in his capital, stipulated important privileges for his countrymen, and laid the foundation of a trade which was immediately prosecuted to no inconsiderable extent. This voyage but little damped the hopes of obtaining a northeast passage to the riches of India. Some vigorous attempts were made by the company in whose hands the commerce of Russia was placed, the last of them in 1580, when 2 ships were sent out to explore the passage through the Straits of Waigads. After struggling with many perils and difficulties from the ice and the cold, one of the vessels returned unsuccessful, the other was never heard of more. Before this hope was regarded as desperate, the project of obtaining the passage by the northwest was resumed with ardor. No fewer than 6 voyages were made in the course of a few years. 2 barks of 25 tons each, and a pinnace of 10, sailed under Martin Frobisher in the year 1567, and entered Hudson's Bay, which at first they imagined was the inlet about to conduct them to the golden shore. The same navigator was encouraged to make a second attempt in the same direction in 1576. As he brought home in these voyages some minerals which were supposed to be impregnated with gold, the attention of the government was excited, and 2 years afterwards Frobisher was sent out with 15 of the Queen's ships, carrying miners for the supposed ore, and 120 persons as the rudiments of a colony. Having spent his provisions, and lost one of his ships, but not found the expected passage, nor left his settlers, he returned with 300 tons of the supposed treasure, which proved to be only a glittering sand. The nation persevered in its hopes and enterprises. A few years afterwards, Captain John Davis sailed as far as 66 degrees 40 minutes north, and discovered the straits distinguished by his name. In a second voyage, undertaken in 1586, he explored in vain the inlet which he had thus discovered. After a few years he was enabled to proceed in a third expedition, but had no better success than the preceding 2. After so many efforts to discover a new passage to India, the English resolved to be no longer deterred by the pretensions of the Portuguese. A voyage to China by the Cape of Good Hope was undertaken in 1582. 4 ships proceeded to the coast of Brazil, fought with some Spanish men of war, and were obliged to return for want of provisions. Another expedition consisting of 3 ships was fitted out in 1596. the commander of which was furnished with Queen Elizabeth's letter to the Emperor of China. This voyage proved eminently unfortunate. The ships were driven upon the coast of Spanish America, where only 4 men were preserved alive from the effects of storms, famine, and disease. Amid these unsuccessful endeavors 2 voyages were accomplished, which animated the hopes of the nation, and pointed out the way to more fortunate enterprises. Francis Drake, the son of a clergyman in Kent, who at a tender age had been put an apprentice to the master of a slender bark trading to the coast of Holland and France, had early evinced that passionate ardor in his profession which is the usual forerunner of signal success. He gained the affections of his master, who left him his bark at his death. At the age of 18 he was purser of a ship which sailed to the Bay of Biscay. At 20 he made a voyage to the coast of Guinea. In 1565 he ventured all he possessed in a voyage to the West Indies, which had no success, and in 1567 he served under his kinsman Sir John Hawkins in his unprosperous expedition to the Bay of Mexico. In these different services his nautical skill, his courage, and sagacity had been conspicuously displayed. In 1570 his reputation enabled him to proceed to the West Indies with 2 vessels under his command. So bent was he on executing some great design that he renewed his visit the next year, for the sole purpose of obtaining information. He had no sooner returned than he planned an expedition against the Spaniards, executed it with 2 ships and 73 men, sacked the town of Nombre de Dios, and returned with great treasure. It is said that in this voyage he saw from the top of a high tree, i.e. fancied he saw across the American Isthmus, the Southern Ocean, and became inflamed with the desire of sailing to it in a ship of England. For this expedition he prepared on a great scale, obtaining the commission of the Queen and 5 vessels, one of 100 tons, another of 80, one of 50, another of 30, and a pinnace of 15, manned with 164 select sailors. The historians of this voyage were anxious to display the taste and magnificence as well as judgment of his preparations, expert musicians, rich furniture, utensils of the most curious workmanship, all the vessels of his table silver, and many of those of his cook room. The expedition sailed from Plymouth on the 13th of December, 1577. Having passed the Straits of Magellan and ravaged the western coast of Spanish America, Drake feared the encounter of a Spanish fleet should he attempt to return in the same direction, and formed the bold design of crossing the Pacific Ocean to India, and regaining England by the Cape of Good Hope. With 1 ship and only part of the fleet which remained, he steered along the coast of America to the latitude of 38 degrees north, and then entered upon that immense navigation in which Magellan, the only circumnavigator who preceded him, had suffered so much. No memorable occurrence attended the voyage. Of the islands which have been discovered in the Pacific Ocean, none were observed till he approached the Asiatic coast. Fixing his attention on the Moluccas, of which the fame had been circulated in Europe by the rich spices thence imported by the Portuguese, he passed with little observation the more eastern part of the numerous islands which stud the Indian Sea, and held his course for Tidor. From intelligence received on the passage, he waived his intention of landing on that island, and steered for Ternate, the sovereign of which he understood to be at enmity with the Portuguese. The intercourse which he there commenced forms a remarkable epoch in the history of the British in India, as it was the beginning of those commercial transactions which have led to such important results. The king, having received assurances that his new visitants came with no other intention than that of trading with his country, gave them a very favorable reception. This monarch possessed considerable power, since the English navigators were informed that he ruled over 70 islands, besides Ternate, the most valuable of all the Moluccas, and in the visits which they paid to his court they were eyewitnesses that he could display no contemptible share of magnificence. They exchanged presents with him, received him on board, and traded with his subjects, laid in a cargo of valuable spices, and acquainted themselves with the nature and facilities of a commerce which was so much the object of admiration in Europe. Not satisfied with the information or the commodities which they received on one island, they visited several, being always amazed at their prodigious fertility, and in general delighted with the manners of the inhabitants. Among other places they landed in the great island of Java, famous afterwards as the seat of the Dutch government in India. They held some friendly intercourse with the natives, and departed with a tolerable knowledge both of the character of the people and the productions of the country. They now spread their sails for that navigation between Europe and India, to which the Portuguese claimed an exclusive right, and by which they monopolized the traffic with India. Those discoverers had craftily disseminated in Europe terrific accounts of dangers and horrors attending the navigation round the Cape of Good Hope. As the voyage of the English proved remarkably prosperous, they were surprised and delighted with the safety and ease which seemed to them to distinguish this envied passage, and conceived a still more lofty opinion of the advantages enjoyed by the nation that engrossed it. After leaving Java, the first land which they touched was the Cape of Good Hope. They landed once more at Sierra Leone, on the African coast, where they received such supplies as sufficed for the remainder of the voyage. They arrived at Plymouth on Monday, the 26th of September, 1580, after a voyage of 2 years, 10 months, and a few days, exhibiting to the wondering eyes of the spectators the first ship in England, and the second in the world, which had circumnavigated the globe. The news quickly spread over the whole kingdom, which resounded with the applause of the man who had performed so daring and singular an enterprise. Whoever wished to be distinguished as the patron of merit hastened to confer some mark of his admiration on Captain Drake. The songs, epigrams, poems, and other pieces, which were composed in celebration of his exploits, amounted to several collections. The Queen, after some delay, necessary to save appearances with the Spanish court, which loudly complained of the depredations of Drake, though as reprisals perhaps they were not undeserved, paid a visit in person to the wonderful ship of Deptford, accepted of an entertainment on board, and conferred the honor of knighthood on its captain, observing at the same time that his actions did him more honor than his title. We may form some conception of the ardor which at that time prevailed in England for maritime exploits, by the number of men of rank and fortune who chose to forego the indulgences of wealth, and to embark their persons and properties in laborious, painful, and dangerous expeditions. Among them we find such names as those of the Earls of Cumberland and Essex, of Sir Richard Greenville, of Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Robert Dudley, who prepared squadrons at their own expense, and sailed to various parts of the world. No undertaking of this description was attended with more important circumstances than that of Thomas Cavendish. This gentleman descended from a family of distinction, and inheriting a large estate in the county of Suffolk, had been early fired with a passion for maritime adventure. In a vessel of his own, he had accompanied Sir Richard Greenville in his unsuccessful voyage to Virginia, and now sold or mortgaged his estate, to equip a squadron with which he might rival the glory of Drake. It consisted of 3 ships, the largest of 140 tons, one of 60, and a bark of about 40, supplied with 2 years' provisions, and manned with 126 officers and sailors, of whom several had served in the celebrated expedition of Drake. They sailed from Plymouth on the 21st of July, 1586. Their voyage through the Straits of Magellan, and the depredations which they proceeded to commit along the western coast of the American continent, not only in the spirit of avarice, but even of wanton devastation, form no part of our present subject, and may without regret be left to other inquirers. They had reached the coast of California, and nearly 24 degrees of northern latitude, when, having taken a very rich Spanish ship, and completed their schemes of plunder, they commenced their voyages across the Pacific Ocean. They left the coast of America on the 19th of November, and came in sight of Guam, one of the Ladrone Islands, on the 3rd of January. From this island they were visited by 60 or 70 canoes full of the inhabitants, who brought provisions to exchange for commodities, and so crowded about the ship that the English, when they had finished their traffic, discharged some of their firearms to drive them away. With the Philippines, to which they next proceeded, they opened a more protracted intercourse. They cast anchor at one of the islands, and lay there for 9 days, during which they carried on an active trade with the inhabitants. The cluster of islands to which the Europeans have given the name of the Philippines was discovered by Magellan. Philip II, shortly after his accession to the Spanish throne, planted there a colony of Spaniards by an expedition from New Spain, and a curious commerce had from that time been carried on across the great Pacific between this settlement and the dominions of Spain in the New World. To Manila, the capital of the Philippine colony, the Chinese, who resorted thither in great numbers, brought all the precious commodities of India, and 2 ships were sent annually from New Spain, which carried to the Philippines the silver of the American mines, and returned with the fine productions of the East. The impatience, however, of the natives under the Spanish yoke was easily perceived. When they discovered that the new visitors were not Spaniards, but the enemies of that people, they eagerly testified their friendship, and the princes of the island where Cavendish landed engaged to assist him with the whole of their forces, if he would return and make war upon the common adversary. This adventurous discoverer extensively explored the intricate navigation of the Indian archipelago, and observed the circumstances of the new and extraordinary scene with a quick and intelligent eye. He visited the Ladrones, pursued a roving course among the Philippines, which brought most of them within his view. He passed through the Moluccas, sailed along that important chain of islands, which, extending from the Strait of Malacca, bounds the Indian archipelago to the extremity of Timor, and passing the Strait of Bali between the 2 Javas, cast anchor on the southwest side of the great island of that name. He traded here with the natives for provisions, and formed with them a sort of treaty, stipulating a favorable reception whenever his visit should be renewed. He sailed for the Cape of Good Hope on the 16th of March, careful to treasure up information respecting a voyage which was now the channel of so important an intercourse. He made astronomical observations. He studied the weather, the winds, and the tides. He noted the bearing and position of lands, and omitted nothing which might facilitate a repetition of the voyage to himself or any of his countrymen. He passed the Cape with prosperous navigation about the middle of May, and having touched at St. Helena to recruit his stores, he landed at Plymouth on the 9th of September, 1588. In a letter which, on the very day of his arrival, he wrote to Lord Hudson, then Chamberlain to Queen Elizabeth, he says: "I navigated to the islands of the Philippines, hard upon the coast of China, of which country I have brought such intelligence as hath not been heard of in these parts, a country, the stateliness and riches, of which I fear to make report of, lest I should not be credited. I sailed along the islands of Moluccas, where among some of the heathen people I was well entreated, and where our countrymen may have trade as freely as the Portugals, if they themselves will. The tide of maritime adventure which these splendid voyages were calculated to increase flowed naturally towards India, by reason of the fancied opulence of the East, and the passion for Indian commodities which prevailed at that time in Europe. The impatience of our countrymen had already engaged them in a circuitous traffic with that part of the globe. They sailed to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, where they found cargoes of Indian goods conveyed over land, and a mercantile company, denominated the Levant Company, was instituted, according to the policy of the age, to secure to the nation the advantages of so important a commerce. The company, too, which, after the discovery of the port of Archangel, had been formed to carry on the trade with Russia, had opened a communication with Persia, whence they imported Indian goods to satisfy the demand of the English. Mr. Anthony Jenkinson, an active and enterprising agent of the Russia Company, sailed down the Volga in 1558 to the Caspian Sea, which he crossed into Persia, and at Bulgar, a city of some importance, found merchants from various parts of the Persian Empire, from Russia, from India, and China. This voyage he performed 7 times, and opened a considerable trade for raw and wrought silk, for carpets, spices, precious stones, and other Asiatic productions. In 1563 there was business enough to require the presence of 3 agents at Kasbin, the seat of the Persian court, and the traffic flourished for several years. Accidental circumstances contributed to enliven the admiration excited by the Indian trade. During that expedition to the coast of Spain, on which Sir Francis Drake was sent by Queen Elizabeth to harass the Spanish shipping, and prevent as far as possible the preparations for the Invincible Armada, he took one of the Portuguese ships from India, known at that time by the name of Carracks. The value of her cargo inflamed the imagination of the merchants, and the papers which she carried afforded information respecting the traffic in which she was engaged. A still more important capture of the same sort was made in 1593. An expedition fitted out for the West Indies by Sir Walter Raleigh, and commanded by Sir John Burroughs, encountered near the Azores the greatest of all the Portuguese carracks, a vessel of 1,600 tons, carrying 700 men and 36 brass cannon, and, after an obstinate contest, carried her into Dartmouth. She was the largest vessel ever seen in England, laden with spices, calicoes, silk, gold, pearls, drugs, porcelain, ebony, etc., and by her riches inflamed the impatience of the English to be engaged in so opulent and brilliant a commerce. Some members of the Turkey or Levant Company finished about the same time an expedition into India. They had carried some cloth, tin, and other goods from Aleppo to Baghdad, which they next conveyed down the Tigris to Ormuz in the Persian Gulf, and thence transported to Goa, the great mart between the Portuguese and Indians on the coast of Malabar. From this place they commenced an extensive survey of the adjoining countries, repaired to Agra, at that time the capital and residence of the Mogul Emperor, visited Lahore, traversed Bengal, travelled to Pegu and Malacca, and returning by sea to Ormuz, retraced their steps to Aleppo, whence they sailed for England, bearing with them important and extensive information respecting the countries they had explored. Intelligence now poured itself upon the nation by a variety of channels. An Englishman of the name of Stevens had sailed with the Portuguese from Lisbon to Goa by the Cape of Good Hope, and wrote an account of his voyage, which was read with avidity, and contributed to swell the general current of enterprise which now ran so vehemently toward India. The first application which was made to government was by a memorial in the name of divers merchants, addressed to the Lords of Council in 1589, for the royal permission to send 3 ships and as many pinnaces on a voyage to India. They enumerated the different places at which the Portuguese had already effected settlements, on the coast of Malabar and Coromandel, in Malacca, and in the Banta and Molucca Islands, places from which it seemed to be tacitly understood that other nations were bound to abstain. But they added that the islands and shores of the Indian Ocean presented many other places which were open to the enterprise of the English merchants, and from an intercourse with which the nation might reap the greatest advantage. What reception this application received is little known. But the unfortunate expedition of Captain Raymond, remarkable as being the first of which India was the immediate destination, though its object was not so much trade as plunder, by cruising against the Portuguese, was fitted out in 1591. Disease had made such ravages among the crews before they reached the Cape of Good Hope, that one of the vessels was obliged to be sent home with the sick, and the rest, 2 in number, had not long doubled the Cape, when the principal ship was lost in a storm. Captain James Lancaster, in the remaining vessel, after a disastrous voyage to the east, sailed to the West Indies, where he lost the ship, and with great difficulty found means to return in a French privateer. But while the English fluctuated between desire and execution in this important project, the Dutch, in 1595, boldly sent 4 ships to trade with India by the Cape of Good Hope. This expedition added fuel at once to the jealousy and ambition of the English. In 1599 an association was formed and a fund subscribed, which amounted to £30,133 6s. 8d, and consisted of 101 shares, the subscription of individuals varying from £100 to £3,000. It was agreed to petition the Queen for a warrant to fit out 3 ships and export bullion, and also for a charter of privileges. A committee of 15, the origin and foundation of the Court of Directors, were chosen to manage. The approbation of the government was readily signified, but as a treaty was then pending with Spain, policy counselled delay. The subscribers, known by the name of the adventurers, were impatient, and presented a memorial, setting forth the places with which the Spaniards and Portuguese had established an intercourse, and pointed out other parts to which, without any ground of complaint on the part of those nations, the English might with unspeakable advantage resort. The council replied that it was more beneficial for the general state of merchandise to entertain a peace than that the same should be hindered by the standing with ye Spanish commissions for the maintaining of this trade, to forego the opportunity of the concluding of the peace. The memorial was referred to Sir Fulk Greville, who made a favourable report. And in the course of the same year, the Queen sent John Mildenhall overland by Constantinople on an embassy to the Mogul. It was attended with little success. The Portuguese and Venetian agents exerted themselves to raise suspicions against the designs of the English, and effectually obstructed the endeavours of the ambassador. Towards the end of the year 1600, the efforts of the adventurers were renewed. The consent of government to proceed in preparation for an Indian voyage was obtained, while the patent of incorporation was still under consideration. Meanwhile an application was made from government, with what view does not appear, for the employment of Sir Edward Michelborne in the expedition. The answer of the committee, whose situation, that of petitioner for a favour not yet conceded, might have counselled complaisance, affords a curious specimen of their independence and of the mode of thinking of the times. They stated it as their resolution not to employ any gentleman in any place of charge, and requested that they may be allowed to sort their business with men of their own quality, lest the suspicion of the employment of gentlemen being taken hold upon by the generalities do drive a greater number of the adventurers to withdraw their contributions. The adventure was prosecuted with ardor. On the 8th of October, the 5 following ships were already provided: the Malice Scourge, of 200 men and 600 tons burden; the Hector, of 100 men and 300 tons; the Ascension, of 80 men and 260 tons; the Susan, of 80 men and 240 tons; a Pinnace, of 40 men and 100 tons. To provision these ships for 20 months the cost was computed at £6,600 4s. 10d., and the cargo, consisting of iron and tin, wrought and unwrought, of lead, cloths, and some smaller articles, chiefly intended as presents for the persons in power in the different places at which the ships might touch, was estimated exclusive of bullion at £4,545. It was determined that 36 factors or supercargoes should be appointed for the voyage, divided into separate classes, rising above one another in trust and emoluments. Captain James Lancaster, whose difficult return from a predatory expedition to the Indian seas has already been mentioned, was chosen to command the fleet, and on the 31st of December the charter of privileges was obtained. This charter, the origin of a power so anomalous and important as that which was afterwards accumulated in the hands of the East India Company, contained nothing which remarkably distinguished it from the other charters of incorporation so commonly in that age bestowed upon trading associations. It constituted the adventures of a body politic and corporate by the name of the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading to the East Indies, and vested them with the usual privileges and powers. The plan which they had already adopted for the management of their affairs, by a committee of 24 and a chairman, both to be chosen annually, was confirmed and rendered obligatory, with a reservation in favor of the rights granted to other associations, and with prohibition extending to all such places as might be already occupied by the subjects of states in amity with her Majesty, and whose objection to rivals should be declared, the privilege of trading to the East Indies, that is, to all places beyond the Cape of Good Hope and the Straits of Magellan, was bestowed upon the Company, with the power to export in every voyage £30,000 in gold and silver, to export English goods for the first 4 voyages exempt from duties, and to re-export Indian goods into English ships under the same privilege to the end of the charter. According to the principle of the times, the charter was exclusive, prohibiting the rest of the community from trading within the limits, but granting to the Company the power, whenever they pleased, of bestowing licenses for that purpose. It was granted for a period of 15 years, but under condition that, if not found to be advantageous to the country, it might be annulled at any time after a notice of 2 years. If advantageous to the country, it might, if desired by the Company, be renewed for 15 years. The ardor of individuals, where anything is to be risked, is more easily excited than upheld. Though the list of subscribers, while the scheme of Indian adventure was yet only in contemplation, had been readily filled up, the calls of the committees for the payment for the installments were very imperfectly obeyed. Even when the charter was obtained, it was either understood to confer no power of compelling payment, or the directors were afraid to make use of that power. Instead of extracting the stipulated sums and trading upon the terms of the joint stock company, the subscribers who were disposed to adventure were invited to take upon themselves the expense of the voyage, and as they sustained the whole of the risk, to reap the whole of the profit. The sums which were thus advanced amounted to £68,373, which greatly exceeded the capital originally subscribed. Of this, £39,771 was expended in the purchase and equipment of ships. The four, excluding the pinnace, which were taken up by the committee of original adventurers, £28,742 was expended in bullion, and £6,860 in goods, consisting partly of British commodities, cloth, lead, tin, cutlery, glass, etc., partly of foreign, as quicksilver, Muscovy hides, etc. The choice of Captain Lancaster to command the fleet was renewed, and it sailed from Torbay on the 2nd of May, 1601. Carrying letters of recommendations from the Queen to the sovereigns of the different ports to which it might resort. A first and experimental attempt was naturally unproductive of any remarkable result, but the first voyage of the East Indian Company was not discouraging. The first place to India to which the fleet repaired was Akin, a principal city in the island of Sumatra, at which they were favorably received. They formed a treaty of commerce with the chief or sovereign of the place, obtained permission to erect a factory, and having taken on board a quantity of pepper, set sail for the Moluccas. In the Straits of Malacca they captured a Portuguese vessel of 900 tons burthen, carrying calicoes and spices, which sufficed to lade them. They diverted their course, therefore, to Bantam in the island of Java, where the captain, delivering his letters and presents, and meeting with a favorable reception, left some agents, the first rudiments of the company's factories, and returned to England, where he arrived in September 1603, with a handsome profit to his owners on the capital of the voyage. In the course of the years from 1603 to 1613, 8 other voyages were fitted out on similar terms. The first in 1603, under the command of Captain Middleton, consisted of the ships which had but just returned from the preceding voyage, and the capital subscribed was £60,450, of which £48,140 was laid out in the preparation and provision of the ships, £11,160 in bullion, and £1,142 in goods. The second, in 1606, consisted of 3 ships commanded by Captain Keeling, capital £53,500, of which £28,620 was for the equipment of the fleet, £17,600 bullion, and £7,280 goods. The third, in 1607, consisted of 2 ships, £33,000 capital, £14,600, of which for the ships £15,000 bullion, and £3,400 in goods. The fourth voyage, in 1608, had but 1 ship, £13,700, subscription, expense of equipment £6,000, bullion £6,000, goods £1,700. The fifth, in 1609, had 3 ships, larger than any other former voyage. Capital subscribed £82,000. Cost of shipping £32,000. The investment £28,500 bullion, and £21,300 goods. The sixth voyage, in 1610, had 4 ships, and subscription £71,581. divided into 42,500 pounds for shipping, 19,200 pounds bullion, 10,081 pounds goods. The seventh in 1611, of 4 vessels, had 76,355 pounds subscription, expended 48,700 pounds on the fleet, 17,675 pounds in bullion, and 10,000 pounds in goods. The eighth in 1612 had 1 ship, and subscription 7,200 pounds, divided 5,300 pounds for the vessel, 1,250 pounds bullion, and 650 pounds in goods. All these voyages, with one exception, that in 1607, of which both the vessels were lost, were prosperous, the clear profits hardly ever below 100%, being in general more than 200 on the capital of the voyage. The years in which these voyages were performed were not without other incidents of considerable importance. In 1604, the company were alarmed by a license in violation of their charter, granted to Sir Edward Michaelborne and others, to trade to Cathay, China, Japan, Korea, and Cambaya, etc. This injury was compensated in 1609, when the facility and indiscretion of James encouraged the company to aim at a removal of those restrictions which the more cautious policy of Elizabeth had imposed. They obtained a renewal of their charter, confirming all their preceding privileges, and constituting them a body corporate, not for 15 years, or any other limited time, but for ever still, however, providing that on experience of prejudice to the nation, their exclusive privileges should, after 3 years' notice, cease and expire. The earliest of the company's voyages were exclusively directed to the islands in the Indian Ocean, as Sumatra, Java, and Amboyna, the returns being raw silk, fine calicoes, indigo, cloves, and mace. In 1608, the factors at Bantam and in the Moluccas reported that the cloths and calicoes imported from the continent of India were in great request in the islands, and recommended the opening of a trade at Surat and Cambaya to supply them with those commodities which might be exchanged with extraordinary profit for the spice and other productions of the islands. To profit by these advantages, the fleet which sailed under the orders of Sir Henry Middleton in 1609 was directed to steer to the western coast of the Asiatic continent, where they made several attempts to establish a commercial intercourse. At Aden and Mocha they were opposed by the Turks, who surprised one of the ships and made the captain and 70 men prisoners. On the coast of India their endeavors were frustrated by the influence of the Portuguese. A fleet which sailed in 1611 had better success, though attacked at Swally, a place at no great distance from Surat, by a large Portuguese armament. It made a successful defense, and, notwithstanding the intrigues and efforts of the Portuguese, obtained a favorable reception at Surat. The English now succeeded in forming a commercial arrangement. They obtained permission to establish factories at Surat, Ahmedabad, Cambaya, and Goga, which were pointed out by the agents of the company as the best situations. Agreeing to a duty of 3.5%, they stipulated that this should be the only exaction to which their merchandise should be exposed, that protection should be afforded to their factories and their property, even in the case of the death of their agents, secured till the arrival of the following fleet. The Purmon, or decree of the Emperor conferring these privileges, was received on the 11th of January, 1612. This was the first establishment of the English on the continent of India, at that time the seat of one of the most extensive and splendid monarchies on the surface of the globe. End of The History of British India, Chapter 1, by James Mill, 1773 to 1836, published in 1817.
How to Listen to Music by Albertine Woodward Moore. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How to Listen to Music. Listening is an art. It requires close and accurate attention, sympathy, imagination, and genuine culture. Listening to music is an art of high degree. Many derive exquisite enjoyment from it, for music is potent and universal in its appeal. To listen intelligently to music is an accomplishment few have acquired. A great painting presents itself as a completed whole before the observer's eye. It holds on the canvas the fixed place given it by the master from whose genius it proceeded. No intermediary force is needed to come between it and the impression it makes on the beholder. Music, on the contrary, must be aroused from the written or printed page to living tone by the hand or voice of the interpreter, and but a fragment at a time can be made perceptible to the listener's ear. Like a panorama, it comes and goes before the imagination, its kaleidoscopic tints and forms now sharply contrasted, now almost imperceptibly graduated one into the other, but all shaping themselves into a logical union, stamped with the design of a creative mind. Properly to inspect the successive musical images and grasp their significance, in parts and as a whole, demands keen mental alertness. Many are content to listen to music for the mere sensuous impression it creates as it wraps itself about the inner being, lulling a perturbed spirit to rest or awakening longing and aspiration, joy and sadness, according to the nature of the music and the hearer's mood. Some even take pleasure in formulating into words the sensations evoked by the ebb and flow of the tonal waves, and fancy they are thus deriving intellectual profit from music. From both ways of listening, helpful results may accrue, but by no means the greatest. Music is far beyond words, and in attempting to translate it into these, we miss its musical meaning, the best that is in it. As listeners, we derive our highest aesthetic and intellectual satisfaction from the ability to follow, even anticipate, the composer's intention, now finding our expectations fulfilled, now being agreeably disappointed. Failure to catch the opening phrase and preliminary rhythms of the composition make it impossible to appreciate the tonal forms into which they develop, nor may the mind linger over any one part, if we would grasp the work as an unbroken whole. That musical creation alone can afford the noblest delights that prompts and rewards the act of thus closely following the composer's thought. An instance of absolute knowledge of music appears in an anecdote told of Johann Sebastian Bach. When he was present at the performance of a fugue and one of his two most musical sons was with him, he would, as soon as the theme was heard, whisper what devices and developments he thought should be introduced. If the composer had conformed to his idea of construction, he would jog his son to call his attention to the fact. Otherwise, his exceeding modesty and reverent comprehension of the difficulties of the art made him the most lenient of critics. Few have reached the luminous heights this master of masters trod. Even a well-cultivated ear and taste may often be baffled by the intricacies of a fugue, symphony, or other great work of musical art heard for the first time. The best listener beyond the pale of genius will at times feel as one astray in a labyrinth of beauty to which for the moment no clue appears. A single representation will rarely suffice to reveal the full worth of a masterpiece of music. By hearing it often, by admitting it, or some reproduction of it, to our own fireside, we will become familiar with its contents and learn truly to know it. Those who are fortunate enough to have been surrounded from childhood up by the choicest gems of the tonal language, and whose minds are of the deceptive order, will insensibly attain a refinement of taste and delicacy of perception no learned dissertation on music could afford. At the same time, an acquaintance with the materials and elements of which the art is composed, and with the laws that govern them, is essential to enable even one who has heard much to gain the complete enjoyment that comes from understanding. Confident as we are that Prometheus captured his fire from heaven, we ought to learn something of its attributes before we accept it at his hands, that we may be able to distinguish a true spark of the divine flame from the phosphorescent will-o'-the-wisp. The idea so largely accepted that music is an unfathomable mystery, like all half-truth, has wrought much mischief, and has greatly retarded musical progress in social life. Behind the divine art, as behind religion, lies the inscrutable mysteries of life, and in both there is a holy of holies only the consecrated may enter. Before the portals of this are reached, there is a broad, fertile field for intellectual activity, that all may work to advantage, preparing the way to the inner sanctuary. The musician is continually confronted with fresh evidence of the popular ignorance, even among students of music, in regard to the outward form and inner grace of what is conceded to be the most popular of all arts. In a room full of professed music lovers, a definition of counterpoint was recently called for, and no one present could give an intelligent answer. This led to a discussion of musical questions which resulted in the disclosure that not one of the company could define melody, harmony, or rhythm, or had the slightest conception of the meaning of the simplest component parts of the art in whose service they were making plentiful sacrifices. Some knowledge of these things is absolutely imperative, not alone to the student, but to one as well who would listen intelligently to music. Sound and motion constitute the essence of music. Its raw materials are an infinitely rich mass of musical sounds that bear within themselves the possibility of being moulded into form. By the musical builders of the past, they have been carefully considered, mathematically calculated, and have finally resolved themselves into a recognized scale, composed of tones and half-tones. These are the composer's plastic resources. He shapes them precisely as the sculptor fashions the pliable clay with which he strives to bring his ideal to realization. All sounds are the result of atmospheric vibrations affecting the ear. Musical sound, or tone, is produced by regular vibrations, and differs from mere noise whose vibrations are irregular and confused. The pitch of a musical tone rises in proportion with the rapidity of the vibrations that produce it. Tones may be perceived by the human ear ranging from about 16 vibrations in a second to nearly 40,000, more than 11 octaves. Only about 7 octaves are used in music. The science of acoustics is full of interesting facts of this kind, and is of profound value to anyone who would gain an insight into the structure of music. It is unfortunately much neglected. The prime elements of music are melody, harmony, and rhythm. They are perhaps as little realized as its raw materials. Melody is a well-ordered succession of musical sounds, heard one at a time, and selected from a defined, accepted series, not taken at random from a heterogeneous store. Harmony is a combination of well-ordered sounds heard simultaneously, and with suitable concord or agreement. Rhythm is measured movement, or the periodical recurrence of accent, and signifies symmetry and proportion. Melody, unexhausted and inexhaustible, is the initial force, or, as Dr. Marx has called it, the lifeblood of music. Within itself it bears the germ of harmony and rhythm. A succession of tones without harmonious and rhythmic regulation would be felt to lack something. Melody has been designated the golden thread running through the maze of tone, by which the ear is guided and the heart reached. Helmholtz styled it the essential basis of music. In a special sense, it is artistically constructed song. The creation of an expressive melody is a sure mark of genius. Harmony arranges musical sounds with reference to their union, and is regulated by artistic and aesthetic rules and requirements. It has endless modes of transforming, inverting, and intensifying its materials, thus continually affording new means of development. All the intervals and chords used in music had to be discovered one by one. It often took more than a century to bring into a general use a chord effect introduced by some adventuresome spirit. Our scale intervals are the slowly gained triumphs of the human mind. Modern music did not emerge from the darkness of the past until harmony, as we know it, came into active being. Both melody and harmony are controlled by rhythm. It is the master force of the musical organism. Before man was, the ebb and flow of nature had its rhythm. On this elementary rhythm, the one model music finds in nature, the inventive mind of man has builded the wonderfully impressive art rhythms existing in the masterpieces of music. Melodies are made up of smaller fragments known as motives, phrases, and periods or sentences, all of which are judiciously repeated and varied, and derive their individuality from the characteristics of their intervals and rhythms. A motive is the text of a musical composition, the theme of its discourse. The most simple motive, with proper handling, may grow into a majestic structure. In Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, 3 G flats in eighth notes, followed by an E flat in a half note, form a text as of fate knocking at the door, which, when developed, leads to tremendous conflict ending in victory. Those notes that repeat and modify the motive, and are combined under one slur, constitute the phrase, which is similar to a clause in a sentence of words. A period or sentence in music comprises a musical idea, complete in itself, though of a nature to produce, when united with other harmonious ideas, a perfect whole. A simple melody is usually composed of 8 measures, or some number divisible by 4. There are exceptions, as in God Save the King, our America, of which the first part contains 6 measures, the second part 8. Habit and instinct show us that no melody can end satisfactorily without some cadence leading to a note belonging to the tonic or key chord. Very often the first part of a melody will end on a note of the dominant chord, from which a progression will arise in the second part that leads satisfactorily to a concluding note in the tonic chord. Counterpoint, literally point against point, is the art of so composing music in parts that several parts move simultaneously, making harmony by their combination. During the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, the masters of counterpoint shaped the musical materials in use today. So anxious were they to attain perfection of form, they often lost sight of the spirit which alone can give vitality to musical utterances. The great Bach infused this into his fugues, the highest manifestation of the contrapuntal or polyphonic music of old. Meanwhile, the growth of the individual led to the growth of monophony in music, in which one voice stands out prominently, with an accompaniment of other voices. Its instrumental flower was reached in the symphony. Melody reigns supreme in monophonic music. Both the canon and the fugue form a commonwealth in which all voices are rated alike. Viewed rightly, this suits the modern democratic instinct, and there is today a tendency to return to polyphonic writing. It is individuality in union. In the hands of genius it affords the most refined kind of harmony. A thorough knowledge of counterpoint shows the mistake of regarding it merely as a dull relic of a dead past. It is a living reality that, if correctly studied, leads to a solid, dignified, flowing style, rich in design, and independent in its individuality. Counterpoint, said a critic in the London Musical News, shows the student how to make a harmonic phrase like a well-shaped tree, of which every bough, twig, and leaf secures for itself the greatest independence, the fullest measure of light and air. Composer, interpreter, and listener may all profit by the comprehension of counterpoint. From its infancy, modern music has been affected by 2 perpetually warring factors, the classical and the romantic. The first demands reverence for established ideals of formal beauty. The second, striking a note of revolt, compels recognition of new ideals. As in all other departments of art and life, progress in music comes through the continual conflict between the conservative and the radical forces. A position viewed as hazardous and unsuitable in one age becomes the accepted position of the next, and those who have been denounced as musical heretics come to be regarded as musical heroes. Very often the untutored public, trusting to natural instincts, will be in advance of the learned critic in accepting some startling innovation. Old laws may pass away, new laws may come, but the eternal verities on which all manifestations of truth and beauty are based can never cease to be. The scientific laws of music are transitory because they have been tentatively constructed during the gradual development of the musical faculty, says W. H. Haddo in his valuable Studies in Modern Music. No power in man is born at full growth. It begins in germ and progresses according to the particular laws that condition its nature. Hence it requires one kind of treatment at one stage, another at another, both being perfectly right and true in relation to their proper period. But there are behind these special rules certain psychological laws which seem, so far as we can understand them, to be coeval with humanity itself, and these form the permanent code by which music is to be judged. The reason why, in past stages, the critics have been so often and so disastrously at fault is that they have mistaken the transitory for the permanent, the rules of musical science for the laws of musical philosophy. An acquaintance with form as the manifestation of law is essential to an intelligent hearing of music. The listener should have at least a rudimentary knowledge of musical construction, from the simplest ballad to the most complex symphony. Having this knowledge, it will be possible to receive undisturbed the impressions music has to give, and to distinguish the trivial and commonplace from the noble and beautiful. The oftener good music is heard, the more completely it will be appreciated. Therefore they listen best to music who hear the best continually. The assertion is often heard that a person must be educated up to an enjoyment of high-class music. Certainly one who has heard nothing else must be educated down to an enjoyment of ragtime, with its crude rhythms. We know a true poem to the extent to which our spirits respond to the spiritual appeal it makes, says Dr. Hiram Corson. It is the same with a true musical composition. We must take something to it in order to receive something from it. Beyond knowledge comes the intuitive feeling which is enriched by knowledge. Through it we may feel the breath of life, the spiritual appeal which belongs to every great work of art and which must forever remain inexplicable. End of How to Listen to Music by Albertine Woodward Moore.
Jesse James's Career in Texas by J. W. Buell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chad Horner, located in Ballyclare, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. As previously stated, Jesse James left Missouri in company with George Shepard and 40 or 50 guerrillas for Texas, where they spent the winter of 1864 to 1865 without special activity, and in the spring it was decided to return to Missouri, although such a decision was pregnant with a renewal of all the dangers from which they had just escaped. Upon reaching Benton County, Jesse James, Arch Clements, and another comrade proceeded to the farmhouse of James Harkness, who was known as an uncompromising Union man. They decoyed him a short distance from his house by requesting him to direct them to a spring which they knew was in the neighborhood. When out of sight of the house, Jesse James and his comrade caught Harkness by the arms and held him firmly, while Arch Clements drew a large bowie knife, with which he cut the throat of the defenseless farmer, almost severing his head. Fresh blood being upon their hands, they rode into Johnson County to the house of Allen Duncan, another Union man, and finding him chopping wood in his yard, Jesse James first accosted him and then sent a bullet into his brain. The guerrilla band, now numbering scarce a score, before getting out of Johnson County were surprised by a company of Federal volunteers and almost annihilated. Jesse James had his horse shot under him, and a musket ball went crashing through his lungs. Supposing him dead, the Federals gave pursuit to the fleeing guerrillas and chased the remaining few for nearly 50 miles. The wounded guerrilla lay for 2 days where he fell in terrible agony and would have died except for the kindly ministrations of a farmer who chanced to find him. The care he received after weeks of suffering enabled him again to resume the saddle, and he went to Nebraska, where his mother was temporarily living and where he remained until the return of Frank James from Kentucky late in the following summer. Before Frank left Brandenburg, however, he met with an adventure which nearly cost his life. The vicinity of Brandenburg was infested with horse thieves, and suspicion was directed against Frank as one of the guilty band. It was determined to arrest him, and for this purpose a posse of 6 men went to the house where he was stopping, and after charging him with horse stealing, demanded his arms. The response was most unexpected, for with an oath he drew his pistol and shot 3 of the party, and in return was badly wounded in the thigh. The other 3 fled, but a large crowd soon collected, to intimidate which Frank backed up against the house and threatened to shoot anyone who made the least motion to harm him. A horse was standing hitched conveniently near, and compelling the crowd to fall back, he drew his suffering body up into the saddle and made his escape. The wound proved a very serious one and kept him confined to his bed at the house of a friend, where he found refuge nearly 75 miles from Brandenburg for several months. End of Jesse James's career in Texas by J.W. Buell.
John Quincy Adams and the Right of Petition by Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cook. He rests with the immortals. His journey has been long. For him no wail of sorrow, but paean full and strong. So well and bravely has he done the work be found to do, to justice, freedom, duty, God, and man forever true. Whittier. The lot of ex-presidents of the United States, as a rule, has been a life of extreme retirement. But to this rule there is one marked exception. When John Quincy Adams left the White House in March 1829, it must have seemed as if public life could hold nothing more for him. He had had everything, apparently, that an American statesman could hope for. He had been minister to Holland and Prussia, to Russia and England. He had been a senator of the United States, Secretary of State for 8 years, and finally President. Yet, notwithstanding all this, the greatest part of his career and his noblest service to his country were still before him when he gave up the presidency. In the following year, 1830, he was told that he might be elected to the House of Representatives, and the gentleman who made the proposition ventured to say that he thought an ex-president, by taking such a position, quote, instead of degrading the individual, would elevate the representative character, end quote. Mr. Adams replied that he had, quote, in that respect, no scruples whatever. No person can be degraded by serving the people as representative in Congress, nor, in my opinion, would an ex-president of the United States be degraded as serving as a selectman of his town, if elected thereto by the people, end quote. A few weeks later he was chosen to the House, and the district continued to send him every 2 years from that time until his death. He did much excellent work in the House, and was conspicuous in more than one memorable scene, but here it is possible to touch on only a single point, where he came forward as the champion of a great principle, and fought a battle for the right which will always be remembered among the great deeds of American public men. Soon after Mr. Adams took his seat in Congress, the movement for the abolition of slavery was begun by a few obscure agitators. It did not at first attract much attention, but as it went on, it gradually exasperated the overbearing temper of the Southern slaveholders. One fruit of this agitation was the appearance of petitions for the abolition of slavery in the House of Representatives. A few were presented by Mr. Adams without attracting much notice, but as the petitions multiplied, the Southern representatives became aroused. They assailed Mr. Adams for presenting them, and finally passed what was known as the gag rule, which prevented the reception of these petitions by the House. Against this rule Mr. Adams protested, in the midst of the loud shouts of the Southerners, as a violation of his constitutional rights. But the tyranny of slavery at that time was so complete that the rule was adopted and enforced, and the slaveholders undertook in this way to suppress free speech in the House, just as they also undertook to prevent the transmission through the mails of any writings adverse to slavery. With the wisdom of a statesman and a man of affairs, Mr. Adams addressed himself to the one practical point of the contest. He did not enter upon a discussion of slavery's abolition, but turned his whole force toward the vindication of the right of petition. On every petition day he would offer, in constantly increasing numbers, petitions which came to him from all parts of the country for the abolition of slavery, in this way driving the Southern representatives almost to madness, despite the rule which prevented the reception of such documents then offered. Their hatred of Mr. Adams is something difficult to conceive, and they were burning to break him down, and, if possible, drive him from the House. On February 6, 1837, after presenting the usual petitions, Mr. Adams offered one upon which he said he should like the judgment of the Speaker as to its propriety, inasmuch as it was a petition from slaves. In a moment the House was in tumult, and loud cries of expel him," rose in all directions. One resolution after another was offered, looking toward his expulsion or censure, and it was not until February 9th, 3 days later, that he was able to take the floor in his own defense. His speech was a masterpiece of argument, invective, and sarcasm. He showed, among other things, that he had not offered the petition, but had only asked the opinion of the Speaker upon it, and that the petition itself prayed that slavery should not be abolished. When he closed his speech, which was quite as savage as any made against him, and infinitely abler, no one dared to reply, and the idea of censuring him was dropped. The greatest struggle, however, came 5 years later when, on January 21st, 1842, Mr. Adams presented the petition of certain citizens of Haverhill, Massachusetts, praying for the dissolution of the Union on account of slavery. His enemies felt that now at last he had delivered himself into their hands. Again arose the cry for his expulsion, and again vituperation was poured out upon him, and resolutions to expel him freely introduced. When he got to the floor to speak in his own defense, he faced an excited House almost unanimously hostile to him, and possessing, as he well knew, both the will and the power to drive him from its walls. But there was no wavering in Mr. Adams. Quote, "If they say they will try me," he said, "they must try me. If they say they will punish me, they must punish me. But if they say that in peace and mercy they will spare me expulsion, I disdain and cast away their mercy. And I ask if they will come to such a trial and expel me. I defy them. I have constituents to go to, and they will have something to say if this House expels me. Nor will it be long before the gentlemen will see me here again." End quote. The fight went on for nearly a fortnight, and on February 7th the whole subject was finally laid on the table. The sturdy, dogged fighter, single-handed and alone, had beaten all the forces of the South and of slavery. No more memorable fight has ever been made by one man in a parliamentary body, and after this decisive struggle the tide began to turn. Every year Mr. Adams renewed his motion to strike out the gag rule and force it to a vote. Gradually the majority against it dwindled until at last, on December 3rd, 1844, his motion prevailed. Freedom of speech had been vindicated in the American House of Representatives. The right of petition had been won, and the first great blow against the slave power had been struck. 4 years later, Mr. Adams fell, stricken with paralysis, at his place in the House, and a few hours afterward, with the words, "This is the last of earth, I am content," upon his lips, he sank into unconsciousness and died. It was a fit end to a great public career. His fight for the right of petition is one to be studied and remembered, and Mr. Adams made it practically alone. The slaveholders of the South and the representatives of the North were alike against him. Against him, too, as his biographer, Mr. Morse, says, was the class in Boston to which he naturally belonged by birth and education. He had to encounter the bitter resistance of his own set of the, quote, conscienceless respectability of wealth, end quote. But the great body of the New England people were with him, as were the voters of his own district. He was an old man, with the physical infirmities of age. His eyes were weak and streaming. His hands were trembling. His voice cracked in moments of excitement. Yet in the age of oratory, in the days of Webster and Clay, he was known as the Old Man Eloquent. It was what he said, more than the way he said it, which told. His vigorous mind never worked more surely and clearly than when he stood alone in the midst of an angry house, the target of their hatred and abuse. His arguments were strong, and his large knowledge and wide experience supplied him with every weapon for defense and attack. Beneath the lash of his invective and his sarcasm, the hottest of the slaveholders cowered away. He set his back against a great principle. He never retreated an inch. He never yielded. He never conciliated. He was always an assailant, and no man and no body of men had the power to turn him. He had his dark hours. He felt bitterly the isolation of his position, but he never swerved. He had good right to set down in his diary when the gag rule was repealed, "Blessed, forever blessed, be the name of God." End of John Quincy Adams and the Right of Petition by Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt.
Letter from William Blake to Mr. Butts, 16th August, 1803. From the Letters of William Blake, edited from the original manuscripts, with an introduction and notes by Archibald G. B. Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. To Mr. Butts, Felpham, 16th August, 1803. Dear Sir, I send 7 drawings, which I hope will please you. This, I believe, about balances our account. Our return to London draws on apace. Our expectation of meeting again with you is one of our greatest pleasures. Pray, tell me how your eyes do. I never sit down to work, but I think of you, and feel anxious for the sight of that friend whose eyes have done me so much good. I omitted very unaccountably to copy out in my last letter that passage in my rough sketch which related to your kindness in offering to exhibit my 2 last pictures in the gallery in Berners Street. It was in these words: I sincerely thank you for your kind offer of exhibiting my 2 pictures. The trouble you take on my account, I trust, will be recompensed to you by him who seeth in secret. If you should find it convenient to do so, it will be gratefully remembered by me among the other numerous kindnesses I have received from you. I go on with the remaining subjects which you gave me commission to execute for you, but I shall not be able to send any more before my return, though perhaps I may bring some with me finished. I am, at present, in a bustle to defend myself against a very unwarrantable warrant from a justice of peace in Chichester, which was taken out against me by a private in Captain Leith's troop of First or Royal Dragoons, for an assault and seditious words. The wretched man has terribly perjured himself, as has his comrade, for as to sedition, not one word relating to the king or government was spoken by either him or me. His enmity arises from my having turned him out of my garden, into which he was invited as an assistant by a gardener at work therein, without my knowledge that he was so invited. I desired him, as politely as possible, to go out of the garden. He made me an impertinent answer. I insisted on his leaving the garden. He refused. I still persisted in desiring his departure. He then threatened to knock out my eyes with many abominable imprecations, and with some contempt for my person. It affronted my foolish pride. I therefore took him by the elbows and pushed him before me till I had got him out. There I intended to have left him, but he, turning about, put himself into a posture of defiance, threatening and swearing at me. I, perhaps foolishly, and perhaps not, stepped out at the gate, and putting aside his blows, took him again by the elbows, and, keeping his back to me, pushed him forward down the road, about 50 yards, he all the while endeavoring to turn round and strike me, and raging and cursing, which drew out several neighbors. At length, when I had got him to where he was quartered, which was very quickly done, we were met at the gate by the master of the house, the Fox Inn, who is the proprietor of my cottage, and his wife and daughter, and the man's comrade and several other people. My landlord compelled the soldiers to go indoors, after many abusive threats against me and my wife from the 2 soldiers, but not one word of threat on account of sedition was uttered at that time. This method of revenge was planned between them after they got together into the stable. This is the whole outline. I have for witnesses the gardener, who is hostler at the Fox, and who evidences that, to his knowledge, no word of the remotest tendency to government or sedition was uttered. Our next-door neighbor, a miller's wife, who saw me turn him before me down the road, and saw and heard all that happened at the gate of the inn, who evidences that no expression of threatening on account of sedition was uttered in the heat of their fury by either of the dragoons. This was the woman's own remark, and does high honor to her good sense, as she observes that whenever a quarrel happens, the offense is always repeated. The landlord of the inn and his wife and daughter will evidence the same, and will evidently prove the comrade perjured, who swore that he heard me, while at the gate, utter seditious words, and the K-, without which perjury I could not have been committed, and I had no witnesses with me before the justices who could combat his assertion, as the gardener remained in my garden all the while, and he was the only person I thought necessary to take with me. I have been before a bench of justices at Chichester this morning, but they, as the lawyer who wrote down the accusation told me in private, are compelled by the military to suffer a prosecution to be entered into, although they must know, and it is manifest, that the whole is a fabricated perjury. I have been forced to find bail. Mr. Haley was kind enough to come forward, and Mr. Seagrave, printer at Chichester, Mr. H. in £50, and Mr. S. in £50, and myself am bound in £100 for my appearance at the Quarter Sessions, which is after Michaelmas. So I shall have the satisfaction to see my friends in town before this contemptible business comes on. I say contemptible, for it must be manifest to everyone that the whole accusation is a wilful perjury. Thus you see, my dear friend, that I cannot leave this place without some adventure. It has struck a consternation through all the villages round. Every man is now afraid of speaking to or looking at a soldier, for the peaceable villagers have always been forward in expressing their kindness for us, and they express their sorrow at our departure as soon as they hear of it. Everyone here is my evidence for peace and good neighborhood. And yet, such is the present state of things, this foolish accusation must be tried in public. Well, I am content. I murmur not, and doubt not that I shall receive justice, and am only sorry for the trouble and expense. I have heard that my accuser is a disgraced sergeant. His name is John Schofield. Perhaps it will be in your power to learn somewhat about the man. I am very ignorant of what I am requesting of you. I only suggest what I know you will be kind enough to excuse if you can learn nothing about him, and what I as well know, if it is possible, you will be kind enough to do in this matter. Dear sir, this perhaps was suffered to clear up some doubts, and to give opportunity to those whom I doubted to clear themselves of all imputation. If a man offends me ignorantly, and not designedly, surely I ought to consider him with favor and affection. Perhaps the simplicity of myself is the origin of all offenses committed against me. If I have found this, I shall have learned a most valuable thing, well worth 3 years' perseverance. I have found it. It is certain that a too passive manner, inconsistent with my active physiognomy, had done me much mischief. I must now express to you my conviction that all is come from the spiritual world for good, and not for evil. Give me your advice in my perilous adventure. Burn what I have peevishly written about any friend. I have been very much degraded and injuriously treated. But if it all arise from my own fault, I ought to blame myself. Oh, why was I born with a different face? Why was I not born like the rest of my race? When I look, each one starts. When I speak, I offend. Then I'm silent and passive, and lose every friend. Then my verse I dishonor, my pictures despise, my person degrade, and my temper chastise. And the pen is my terror, the pencil my shame. All my talents I bury, and dead is my fame. I am either too low or too highly prized. When elate I am envied, when meek I'm despised. This is but too just a picture of my present state. I pray God to keep you and all men from it, and to deliver me in his own good time. Pray write to me, and tell me how you and your family enjoy health. My much terrified wife joins me in love to you and Mrs. Butts and all your family. I again take the liberty to beg of you to cause the enclosed letter to be delivered to my brother, and remain sincerely and affectionately yours, William Blake. End letter from William Blake to Mr. Butts, 16th August, 1803. From the Letters of William Blake, edited from the original manuscripts, with an introduction and notes by Archibald G. B. Russell. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.